Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Nika Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Awaken Quirk earlier. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. The rush of patrol had never faded over the years. Possible danger around every corner, the chances of making a difference during each interaction, pushing his body to its limits. Izuku was hardly ever seen without a smile on his face during patrol, even when he was exhausted and hurting. It was why he was making a name for himself as an upcoming hero, only a few months away from graduating from UA. Well, that and playing a part in taking down the most dangerous villains in their history. He and the rest of his classmates would never shake that part of their history at UA. That night, he found himself with an underground hero who liked to run just as much as he did. Her hero name was Bullet and her quirk allowed her to move twice as fast as a normal person. She could only use her quirk for 10 minutes or so at a time, but she tended to run most of her patrol because of it. It was part of the reason he'd chosen her. A few weeks ago, Mr. Aizawa had suggested Class 3A do a shift with an underground hero before they graduate. To gain a better understanding of the other side of hero work, Mr. Aizawa had said. He'd made it clear it wasn't mandatory, but it was highly recommended. A few students had already completed the shift, though not everyone had taken the recommendation. But Izuku had. In fact, he'd been looking forward to it since he went through the list of underground heroes willing to take one of Mr. Aizawa's students. The man had connections, that was for sure. Bullet had told Izuku first thing that any student of Eraserheads was almost guaranteed to be a wonderful hero. Izuku had blushed and said he was grateful for his teacher, which was the absolute truth. Bullet leapt off the edge of the roof, angling toward the next one. Izuku jumped after her, lashing out with Black Whip a second later. Black Whip wrapped around her waist and propelled her forward just enough to keep from plummeting into the alley below, landing on the other roof without stumbling. She cursed, realizing she nearly jumped to her death as she misjudged the distance. Izuku only grinned. In the year and some change since the war ended and his class found themselves as survivors, every one of them had grown. They'd become more confident, some more than others. Humility came along with it. Izuku recognized it in himself, the growth. He spoke with more conviction, with more certainty. He carried himself taller, though that might have had something to do with his growth spurt. He didn't meet Bakugo's or Shinso's height, but he was no longer the first year who blended in with the crowd. It also helped he'd filled out his taller form. New muscles. New scars. He certainly looked the part of a hero. Well, that was what his mom told him. He still hadn't kicked the habit of muttering to himself. He was still awkward and nervous and tripped over himself, especially now that he had more to trip over, but he wasn't stupid. Even a blind person could see that he was no longer the same Izuku as before. It had hit him after they returned from the break and the female population of UA seemed to see him for the first time. Girls passed him notes in the halls and shyly asked him out in the cafeteria or in front of their dorm building. It wasn't every day, but it was frequently enough for him to mark a pattern. Of course, he'd also learned to turn them down as gently as he could. A problem he never thought he'd have. For the moment, he wanted to focus on becoming a hero. It was right in front of him, glittering and waiting. After all they'd survived, he wanted it so badly he could taste it. It was why he'd eagerly taken up Mr. Aizawa's recommendation to do a shift with an underground hero. New experiences were his bread and butter. That night, the shift had been quiet. Bullet had remarked that it wasn't always like this. Of course he knew that. It wasn't often, but Mr. Aizawa would occasionally come to class with a black eye or a new injury he was nursing from the patrol the night before. Bullet and Izuku had run into a few small fights, but nothing that took all their effort. The quiet did give her time to explain the job of an underground hero to him in great detail. He was absorbing her words like a sponge. She kind of reminded him of Mr. Aizawa. She got to the point and didn't see the need to waste words or sentiment. If he did something stupid, she pointed it out so he could improve. He was pretty used to that kind of treatment, what with a teacher like Mr. Aizawa and a friend like Bakugo. They both should have known the quiet of the night meant trouble was waiting for them. It was nearing the end of the shift, only a few hours before the sun would be up. Izuku estimated he could grab 2 hours of sleep before he had to be in class. He wondered if Mr. Aizawa would overlook him falling asleep during any of his classes and winced as he guessed the answer was no. The two were walking along the sidewalk, heading back toward the agency she belonged to, when danger sense activated and Izuku instantly shifted into a fighting stance. Something's coming, he told her quietly. She stood at his back and adopted a similar position. She fought with knives and pulled them from her belt in preparation. He did not expect to see Nomo lumber out of the shadows, but there they were. One after another until every exit was blocked by the massive creatures. He narrowed his eyes, brows furrowing. On 3, kid, Bullet whispered. He nodded, though she couldn't see him. As soon as she counted down, the two jumped into action. Izuku activated One for All and used it to tear down as many Nomu as he could as quickly as possible. He knew he could take a punch, but Nomu were on a different level. He didn't know if those Nomu had quirks, but he wasn't taking any chances. Whether it was a quirk or some strange, natural ability, the next Nomu he struck managed to grab onto his leg and throw him against the nearest building. His back slammed into the wall and he gagged on his breath. As he crumbled to the ground, the Nomu advanced. It grabbed the back of his costume and lifted him. He struck the thing as hard as he could, but it didn't make a dent. It was like the Nomu from the USJ, he realized in horror. The Nomu All Might had barely defeated. The Nomu that still haunted his dreams sometimes as he remembered the horrors they'd faced during their first year. It was a Nomu he didn't know if he could defeat. The Nomu practically threw him back to the ground and stomped down on him hard. It was like getting crushed by a truck. He was held in that position, lying on his stomach and pressing against the Nomu above him, as he heard Bullet's cry. It made him freeze, asphalt cracking underneath his hands as he struggled. Bullet had never fought Nomu, but she held her own against the mass. At least, for a moment. She cut through Nomu after Nomu, running faster than they could track her. Until one stepped forward and matched her movements and caught her arm in its claw-tipped hand. She was brought to a halt by the Nomu and brutally struck down. It hit her over and over again, crushing her under its fists. Izuku winced with each strike, tears leaking out of his eyes as he tried and failed to get up and help her. He could do nothing as the Nomu grabbed her by the throat and lifted her limp body. She was still alive, eyes wide and panicking. Blood covered her from head to toe, yet she kept fighting. Broken arms lifted and crushed hands attempted to ward off the Nomu. She was thrown against the wall where bricks practically exploded around her. Izuku sobbed as her body fell to the ground in a heap. Her eyes were open and trembled. Even from where he lay trapped, he was able to hear her gurgled breathing. They both knew she was dying, moments away from meeting that ending. Yet the Nomu still took the time to drive its claws into her back, cutting through her spine and lungs. No! Izuku shouted. For some reason, the Nomu over him didn't do the same. It was simply holding him down. Izuku sobbed through his clenched teeth. He continued to fight against the Nomu, pushing his body to the brink of breaking. The asphalt underneath him crumbled under his power and he felt the Nomu's body slowly give way against him. He was doing it. He could defeat it. He could save Bullet. The last thing he felt was the Nomu's fist slamming into the base of his skull. XXX. As a hero student, Izuku was used to waking up after taking a beating. There was the familiar disorientating, head throbbing as he blinked open tired eyes. After the war, their class had not yet learned to hold back. They were training for the first time since they all recovered, each bearing their own scars physically and mentally. They'd all thought they were fine, that they'd have no trouble bouncing back and running themselves through a mock battle. They'd been wrong. Nearly every single one of them had gone too hard and injured another classmate or themselves or both. Izuku, Kirishima, and Bakugo had all found themselves collapsed on the ground after attacking each other. Recovery Girl had been called out to the training grounds and scolded Mr. Aizawa something fierce after he allowed them to push themselves that hard. He'd later apologized to their entire class, saying he should have known they needed more time. When the three of them woke in the infirmary, they laid there and realized they weren't the same and they weren't fine. They couldn't bounce back from the war, not in the way they'd thought they could. It was there they each realized the war had taken plenty from them. They were not the same and could never go back to who they had been before Shigaraki came crashing into their lives. When Izuku opened his eyes and did his best to ignore the throbbing in his head, he was once again reminded of that day, of that realization. They were not the same children who joined UA to become the heroes they thought they wanted to be. He knew he wasn't at UA. He remembered the Nomu attacking. He remembered Bullet on the ground, dying breath slowing. But that begged the question, where the hell was he? He got his answer moments later. It didn't take much for him to discover he was lying on a metal surgical table, arms and legs strapped down tightly. He couldn't budge a single inch. He'd been stripped of his clothes, all but his boxers. It left him feeling vulnerable and it made him want to scream. The room was filled with medical equipment and small machines. Cement floors and bare rafters above him. Not a good sign. The door across the room screeched open, metal grinding against metal, and a man walked in. He was short, glasses glinting against the dim lighting in the room, and his lab coat brushed his knees. It was a man Izuku knew of but had never had the pleasure of meeting. The doctor, as everyone called him. Dr. Tsubasa, Garaki, and whatever else he was calling himself. It didn't matter what identity he wore. After they defeated All for One and Shigaraki, many people had fallen in the cracks. Villains and heroes alike. However, the greatest loss they knew about was the doctor. He had managed to escape his captivity during the fighting and was never found. Izuku knew there was a team still looking for him after all this time. Ah, you're awake. I was worried my Nomo might have killed you. It would have been a waste of a specimen. The doctor came up beside him, bringing his face close to Izuku's without warning. Good, you look lively. He pulled back before Izuku could bite his nose off. A shame, really. I know who you are. Why do you want me? Izuku asked, trying to keep the venom from his voice. Mr. Aizawa had lectured them about negotiation tactics and the best way to speak with villains. He remembered the lesson well, but it was incredibly hard to put them into practice when he wanted nothing more than to use his quirk and destroy the doctor. How could he forget? Izuku tried activating his quirk, brow twitching in frustration as nothing happened. DMN. His eyes dipped down to his exposed arm. There was an 4 in the crook of his arm, leading to a bag of fluid hanging over his shoulder. He was feeling sluggish and heavy, so it was entirely likely he was being fed a constant stream of quirk suppressants and a sedative. If he had to guess. The doctor seemed to see his thought process because he smiled. I've heard you're clever, so I can guess you've made some assumptions about the situation. Your quirk is under control, can't have it ruining the fun. As for why I want you, that is a simple answer. Izuku followed the man with his eyes as he grabbed a rolling stool and came to sit beside him. He put his hand on Izuku's arm above the 4 and squeezed. It grew uncomfortable, almost painful. You see, since you all defeated my patron and my greatest project, I've been forced into the shadows. Like a rat. I've been forced to hide. Do you have any idea how much work I lost because of you? He squeezed harder, fingers digging into his skin. You are the reason I am having to start from scratch. You are the reason I am having to work with scraps for my research. The doctor released him and pushed himself away. He rolled behind Izuku, rummaging around in drawers he couldn't see from that angle. You see, I know who you are. Izuku Midoriya. Little Izuku. Oh, I know everything about you. I especially know about your quirk, the mirror to my patron's quirk. It's because I know these things that I also know that quirk is the root of all evil. However, while that quirk infuriates me, it is also a point of intrigue. The man came back into his line of sight holding a syringe. The needle was capped, but it still made Izuku flinch away from it as much as he could, which was, admittedly, very little. Capturing you was a spur-of-the-moment decision. I saw you out with that hero and decided to act. The doctor shrugged. It worked out in the end. Izuku had had enough. What do you want with me? He ground out. That made the doctor uncap the needle and smile. I am a scientist. Before you destroyed everything I did was in the name of discovery. It was logical and had a purpose. To further our society, the very bones of our survival. But then you and everyone around you took it all away from me. You took my research. You took my sponsor. You took my freedom. The man didn't warn Izuku before jamming the needle into Izuku's deltoid, compressing the plunger. The area burned, but it was manageable. Izuku's heart thundered against his ribs as the man said, "You're going to regret everything you and your heroes did. Because now, I am angry. While I can't get my hands on every single person who took away my very purpose on this earth, I have you." His breaths were shallow from fear and he swallowed against the tightness in his throat. Izuku met the doctor's eye. What are you going to do with me? He needed to know. He needed to prepare himself. As it turned out, there was no way to prepare himself for what was to come. The doctor put a hand on Izuku's cheek and smiled once more. I'm going to kill you. But first, I'm going to make it hurt. That night, Shota Aizawa was not on patrol. He hadn't made the choice to remain at home, tucked away in his apartment off campus for the first time in over a month, but he would still blame himself for the years to come. Maybe if he'd been out there, roaming the streets as he usually did, things would have turned out differently. It was a rare thing for him to be away from UA. When he wasn't in the teacher's dorm or out on patrol, he was walking the perimeter of the school in case his wild class decided to stay up past their curfew, something they did every few months to test him. He was sure of it. He liked being there to watch his class and often chose to remain at the school when he didn't have to. But that night, Hisashi had urged him to take a night for himself, to disengage for a few hours. It hadn't taken much pressure for him to give in. He'd thought about picking up a shift, even just a few hours, but he'd gauged his fatigue and decided it was better to get some rest, even if he wasn't sleeping. After the war, Eri had managed to heal him. Honestly, after cutting off his leg and losing his eye, he'd been sure he would never go on patrol again. But that little angel had healed him, bringing back his quirk and his strength. Maybe it was a way for him to give back, a strange sort of repentance he felt was required of him, but since Eri's rewinding he'd been running non-stop. On patrol. With his class. Every day was full to the brim. He shouldn't have taken those few hours off. He'd known Midoriya was on patrol with Bullet, a hero he respected and had personally reached out to in hopes of getting her to take a student of his. She wasn't known for taking students, in fact, she actively avoided them. In her words, they were stupid enough to drown in a puddle. But his class was different. Midoriya was different. Yes, they were idiots at times, but they were a cut above the rest. He had high hopes for them, Midoriya especially. It was honestly a shame he wasn't going underground, but he would make a difference wherever he went. The kid was in the top 3, surprising no one, and ever since the war had shown his dedication and spirit. Todoroki, Bakugo, and Midoriya all fought for that top spot, and was never held by one for long before the other two were fighting for that top seat. He suspected the 3 of them would forever be in a tug-of-war for the #1 hero title. Shota was excited to see where he went, along with the rest of his classmates. Though, he'd never tell them that. He'd spent plenty of effort breaking their spirits, telling them would be counterproductive. He'd been asleep when it happened, phone unplugged and dead in the kitchen where he'd forgotten to grab it before heading to bed. When he woke up early that morning, sun sitting just under the horizon, he slowly went about his routine. Plug the phone in and wait for it to charge enough to turn on. Start the coffee. Grab a jelly pouch instead of actually making breakfast. By the time his phone dinged, telling him he had several unread messages and phone calls, he was sipping on his coffee. Somehow, after reading the text sent by Tsukachi, he managed to set his coffee down before it dropped from his hand. Because his entire body was numb, hands shaking and mind desperately telling him to reread the message, that there was no way it was correct. It had to be wrong. It had to be a mistake. It was not. He was running out of the apartment not 3 minutes later, hero costume on and capture scarf in his hand. XXX. Tell me what happened, Shota demanded as soon as he stepped foot inside the station. Detective Tsukachi met his eyes and sighed wearily, bags under his eyes worse than Shota's. I'm not the detective on the case, but I'm helping however I can, Aizawa. He wordlessly followed Tsukachi through the station to the desk of another detective. It was a man he'd worked with before and respected, but he couldn't help but feel anxious that the case was not Tsukachi's. Detective Kimura gestured for Shota to take a seat as soon as he spotted him. Tell me you found him, Shota said, hands clenched tightly against his thighs. The detective's expression did not comfort him in the least. I'm afraid we haven't, Eraser. This couldn't be happening. He took a grounding breath and asked the detective to tell him everything. He didn't look inclined to do so, but after a nod from Tsukachi the man proceeded. This morning, Bullet was found dead on the sidewalk at this address. Your student was nowhere to be seen. Detective Kimura slid a photo across the desk, address written clearly on the top. The photo was of Bullet, lying on the sidewalk with blood surrounding her. It was gruesome, to say the least. The autopsy hasn't been done yet, but I saw the body myself. She died after taking a serious beating. Broken ribs. Broken arms. Broken everything. Shota did his best to keep his breathing controlled. Logical. He had to think logically. It wasn't his colleague and student. No, it was a random hero he'd never met and a student he didn't adore. It couldn't be them or he would fall apart. I'm sorry. I didn't know her well, but I know you did, the detective started. Shota met his eyes. The case. Tell me about the case. The detective swallowed hard. All right. We found blood on the scene from both Bullet and Midoriya. What about cameras? Any footage? Shota asked, trying to get him to move it along. The detective hesitated, eyes lifting to Tsukachi. The detective standing behind Shota nodded and said, show him everything. He can handle it. Unfortunately, it's not the first time something has happened to a student of his. Unfortunately. That was an understatement. He'd hoped nothing would ever happen to his kids again, not after everything they'd been through. The war was bad enough. He hated looking at the scars they'd been left with. Detective Kimura turned his computer and pulled up a video. It's not great quality. It's from a camera across the street and it doesn't catch all of it. But, he pressed play. Shota watched with growing horror at the scene that unfolded. Bullet and Midoriya were walking down the sidewalk when Midoriya suddenly got into a fighting stance. He said something to Bullet and she did the same. Danger sense, most likely. He watched, eye narrowing, as things began moving in the corner of the screen. The angle of the camera didn't allow him to see the entire view of the other side of the street, but it showed enough. Nomu appeared. His heart nearly stopped in his chest. Nomu seemed to come from everywhere. They surrounded the two of them and blocked the view, though for only a moment. He grabbed the arms of the chair and squeezed as hard as he could. He almost hoped the chair would break. Because he watched Midoriya and Bullet fight for their lives and fail. Midoriya was grabbed and thrown to the ground where a Nomu held him there. Bullet was tossed around like a rag doll after she was caught by one. He stared at her with a clenched jaw, teeth groaning, and knew he was watching her die. He didn't blink until after he saw the Nomo slam its fist into Midoriya's head. The kid went limp and the creature stepped off his back. Shota was not known for showing his emotions on his face, but at that moment he couldn't help it. The Nomo grabbed Midoriya by the back of his costume and held him there as a figure stepped around the other Nomo. It was only when he came to stand in front of Midoriya did Shota see who he was. The doctor. It was him, standing there surrounded by his horrible creatures. The doctor was there, staring up at Midoriya with a gleeful smile on his face. The Nomu and the doctor left the camera view moments later and the detective paused the video. It's clear from the actions in the video that Midoriya was the intended target. Bullet was just collateral damage, Detective Kimura said quietly, nearly in a whisper. Shota closed his eyes and bowed over his knees. He thought he was going to be sick. Midoriya was captured by the doctor. He wasn't on the team looking for the man, but he knew they weren't any closer to finding him than they were when he disappeared. Which meant they had no idea where Midoriya was taken. The doctor had Midoriya. "I'm sorry, Eraser," Tsukachi said, resting a hand on Shota's shoulder. "We're going to find him." Shota stood, needing to do something other than sit there and imagine all the terrible things the doctor was doing to his student. Has anyone told his mother? Shota had only met the woman a few times. She had been closer to All Might when the retired hero still taught at UA and Shota had left him to engage with her. She deserves to know. Detective Kimura nodded and stood with the hero. She actually arrived shortly before you did. I have her sitting in the family room. I told her what we know, at least the basics. She knows her son has been captured and a hero was killed on the scene. The man hesitated. I didn't know what she could handle. What she could handle? What mother would be able to handle any of this, let alone all the gruesome details? Shota sighed again. He knew he would be sighing plenty before this was over and braced himself. I'll talk to her. I assume you've already assigned me to this case? The man nodded in confirmation. The walk to the family room felt like an eternity. The hallway was both too short and too long, and it was as if each step took away what little strength he had left after watching that video. He still didn't know how he was going to face Ms. Midoriya when he knocked and opened the door to the family room. It was nicely furnished, 2 couches in front of a small coffee table and a TV on the wall. There was a coffee machine in there, but he didn't think it worked. Ms. Midoriya sat on the edge of the couch cushion, tear-streaked face turned to the muted TV. Shota's heart clenched, knowing she was waiting for news about her son to appear in front of her. When the door opened, she whipped around to face him. He stood there for a second too long, wondering what the hell he was going to say. A fresh wave of tears came from Ms. Midoriya and she gestured for him to come and sit beside her. You haven't found him, have you? She asked in a whisper. He shook his head, throat suddenly too tight to speak. She pulled out a handkerchief and handed it to him. It's clean. He didn't understand until a tear fell from his chin and hit his leg. He lifted a hand, baffled, and felt his face for more tears. The small woman beside him pressed the handkerchief into his hand. My Izuku is strong. He got through everything with those villains before and he'll get through this, she said. He could tell she was trying to convince herself as well as him, but he appreciated it. Midoriya was strong. He was passionate and never backed down from a fight. He would get through whatever he was enduring, Shota was sure. It didn't make the guilt that had been churning in his gut disappear. If he'd been there, if he hadn't taken a few hours to himself, maybe Midoriya would be safe at home or in his dorm. If Shota hadn't told them to go patrol with underground heroes, maybe he wouldn't be missing, taken by the doctor. Mr. Aizawa, right? Ms. Midoriya asked. He nodded shallowly. Her big green eyes, the same color as Izuku's, it almost hurt to look at her. The two of them looked so DMN similar, were filled to the brim with tears, waiting to spill over. I know you'll do everything you can to find him. I know about everything you've done so far. Izuku could talk about it for hours, and he did some days. I know you've done so much for my son and all his friends. The small woman grabbed his hands tightly in hers. He felt his heart rip in two at her expression. Please, find my son, she begged, those tears finally throwing themselves off their perch. Please bring him home to me. I don't know what I'll do if he. She was never able to finish that sentence, but they were both aware of what followed those words. If he died. If they found him too late. If Shota, as his teacher, was forced to face the loss of one of his best students. If Ms. Midoriya was forced to face the loss of her only son. He didn't ask her if she wanted to know the details of his kidnapping. Even if she said yes, he knew she would be lying. No mother wanted to know those things. No mother should have to know those things. So he tucked it away, locking it in the space in his brain that held every wretched act he had to be witness to in his line of work. Later he could open it. Later he could unpack everything inside that space and hope it was enough to find his student. Facing Ms. Midoriya was hard. It didn't feel like the right word, but he couldn't rack his brain for another one. Hard, that was all her knew. It hurt. It made him want to run away and never look back, forget everything he now knew and tuck himself back in bed. Like it was all a dream, a terrible, horrible nightmare. While facing her was hard, he was preparing himself to tell his class that one of them was missing, kidnapped by an enemy they were all painfully aware had escaped. How was he going to tell Class 3A that Midoriya was currently in the hands of the doctor? Waking was slow, like dragging his entire body through molasses. Not that he'd ever had to do that, but he assumed that was what it would be like. Molasses, slow and sticky and unwilling to let him go. Yeah, that was what waking up felt like. It would have been easier to ignore reality and simply fall back asleep if the table he was laying on wasn't so cold and hard. That had his eyes opening. In an instant, he knew he was in danger. He didn't need his quirk to tell him that, though it was pinging in the back of his brain like a constant droning, a mosquito in his ear. It had him looking at his surroundings, picking up on the little things. None of them made him feel any better. He was still strapped down to the metal table, arms and legs secured without giving him half an inch to wiggle free. And he tried. The 4 in his arm was still there, the line moved away from his head purposefully. If he could grab it with his teeth, he'd be able to remove it, rip it out and, what? He couldn't escape from the table, not without his quirk. While his mind was racing, things felt slower than normal, foggy at the edges of his consciousness. He took a few deep breaths and tried activating his quirk. Nothing, not a flicker of one for all. It was as if he was quirkless again. While he remembered discovering he was being fed a steady stream of sedatives and a quirk suppressant, it felt like a dream. It was like the memory was just far enough away he couldn't quite reach it. He rested his head back against the table and stared up at the bag of fluids hanging over his shoulder. He watched the drops as they fell from the bag, going into the 4 line. He wanted nothing more than to get rid of it, cut the connection between him and it, but he couldn't do anything. Vulnerable. Useless. Scared. He was so scared. Izuku searched his memory, sifting through the pieces scattered around in his head. He remembered getting attacked by Nomu. But what about Bullet? He squeezed his eyes shut and focused. His body went limp in shock as he recalled her body on the ground, the way her bones bent at odd angles and her blood poured from her wounds freely. Dead, most likely. He'd seen enough during the war and in the time since to know what killed. It was an unfortunate part of hero work. Even if help had been right around the corner, he wasn't sure she would have survived. He bit back a sob. Bullet was dead. He was captured. It was not a good situation. Eventually, someone would notice he was missing. It was likely he'd missed class by now. As soon as he didn't show up to school, Mr. Aizawa would figure out what happened. He would be searching for him. It should have given him more hope than it did. How would they find him? He didn't know where he was, but he knew who took him. The doctor was a man who had managed to escape for that long. It meant he knew how to hide. What were the chances they'd be able to find the doctor now? Focus, Izuku, he told himself. He needed to escape. He needed to figure out where he was and get help. First, he needed to focus. However, before he could do much else, the doctor stepped through the door, the Nomu who had taken Izuku down earlier coming in with him. It lumbered after its master as he approached, coming to stand at the foot of the table Izuku couldn't budge from. Suddenly, it didn't matter that he had a powerful quirk. It didn't matter that he'd gotten taller and put on more muscle. It didn't matter that he had gained plenty of skill in fighting and taken down plenty of enemies who had bested others. Because he couldn't use any of those things. He was stuck, laying on that table with the doctor's eyes freely looking him up and down like a slab of meat. I hope you're ready to begin, the man said, folding his hands in front of him. The man's glasses glinted under the light, a single bulb hovering over Izuku and casting the room in ominous shadow. Izuku's lip curled and he narrowed his eyes, all he could do to show the man his hatred. Why don't you just tell me what the hell you want from me? The doctor tilted his head, surveying Izuku like a bird. It unnerved him to no end. Instead of answering, the man turned his attention to the bag of fluids hanging over Izuku's shoulder. He reached up and tapped at it, smiling to himself. Did you know that I nearly perfected this formula? Before you heroes ruined it. The perfect mix of sedation, paralysis, and quirk suppression. He looked back at Izuku. The hero. Student noticed the way his hands clenched. Then my research, all the work I'd spent years of my life discovering, was torn away from me. Thrown away like trash. By you. I didn't do anything to you or your work, Izuku said. The doctor reached out and grabbed Izuku's chin roughly, forcing him to look the man in the eye. The man seemed frantic. You may think that, but you're wrong. It was you and the heroes you're with. You see, before you wrecked everything, All for One was my patron. He provided everything I needed for my research. Subjects. Funding. Equipment. He provided everything so I could focus on my work. And I did for so long, committing myself to my work. The doctor released him, practically shoving his face away. Now I'm left with these scraps, forced to start over. I'm getting closer, but the perfection I'd reached is still too far away from my grasp. All because of you. The man gestured to the bag of fluids again. While not perfect, this formula gets the job done. Just enough to keep you awake, but not enough to give you the strength to fight back. Izuku could count on one hand how many enemies he had. Yes, there were villains out there who likely saw him as their enemy, but he didn't see them that way. Izuku believed most people had the possibility of changing, of turning things around even if they've screwed up or have a twisted view on society. Yet, he hated the doctor. He wanted nothing more than to reach out and strangle the man himself. It didn't matter if he had a little bit of good in him. It didn't matter if he'd saved anyone. Izuku wanted him dead. Nomu, come here, the doctor said, making Izuku freeze in his thoughts. The creature came closer, standing beside the doctor. What are you going to do to me? Izuku dared ask, hating the way his voice shook. The doctor moved around the room, gathering supplies. He pulled over a table and set out his tools, metal clinking on metal and making Izuku wince with each moment of impact. As he prepared his work area, the doctor said, "You're probably not aware, but I've known you since you were a child. You were young, so it's to be expected. Why would you remember me when you were too distracted by the ideas of what quirks you might get?" The man huffed a laugh, to Izuku's growing horror. It's almost funny now, the irony. A quirkless child became one of the strongest enemies I'd come across. A quirkless child took down All for One. Though, it wasn't just you, now was it? That quirk of yours did most of the work. Izuku's heart was pounding. His mind was skipping over the details, desperate to decide which one he wanted to stop and inspect. The doctor knew him? Had known him as a child, even. If it was a lie, it was a terrible one. You asked what I was going to do with you. It's a hard question to answer, and one I don't plan on answering in full just yet. The doctor pulled on a mask and began gowning himself. Izuku had seen surgeons do the same. Since you ruined my work with All for One, I've been forced to continue my discoveries from scratch and without the proper tools or equipment. It's been a learning experience, certainly. But I am nothing if not a professional. I have pushed forward despite the difficulties. With some success, I might add. Though, the man added, shrugging. He finished tying the surgical gown on and began putting on sterile gloves. There are always failures. A side effect of variation in my subjects. The first few months yielded nothing more than failure after failure. Creating Nomu without incubation tanks is nearly impossible, at least the way I was doing it before. I had to change my entire technique. The man emphasized his point with the snap of a glove. He came forward, hands hovering over Izuku's left wrist. Izuku flinched back when the doctor suddenly whipped his head around to meet his eye. The first woman was a terrible subject. She wasn't strong and her quirk was nearly useless. But I gave her a try. Her mind wasn't held together well, but I didn't know that at the time. Midway through the experiments, she went insane. Clawed her own throat out and died in her cage. A shame. Danger Sense was buzzing in his ear, screaming at him to get out, run, do anything more than lay there. The doctor seemed to sense his unease because he came to the head of the table and grabbed something underneath. The doctor used one hand to shove Izuku's head down on the table while the other brought a thick strap up and over his forehead. It took less than a second for him to secure Izuku's head down before he moved back to his hand. The next few dozen were disappointments. There was one man who had an interesting reaction to my experiments. He would have been an amazing Nomu, but it didn't work out. His quirk gave him heat vision. In the end, his eyes melted from his skull and I had to put him down myself. The screaming was very annoying. Izuku couldn't help but tremble on the table. Never in all his life had he ever felt fear that volatile before. Not when he faced All for One or Shigaraki. Never. The doctor rubbed something on Izuku's hand and wrist. He tried flinching away from the man, but he couldn't go very far. Part of my problem was starting too big. I jumped into things too quickly and overwhelmed my subjects. Before, I'd had the resources to avoid the side effects that came with moving too quickly, but not now. A pain, but one that is easy to work with. From his position, all Izuku could see was the doctor's shoulder. He couldn't see his hands or what he was doing over Izuku's body. It was unnerving and horrible. When the resources and techniques aren't up to par, the end result is unpleasant. You get what you put in. I've learned to improvise, but it has been a painful process for everyone, myself included. The doctor leaned into Izuku's line of sight, nothing but his eyes visible. It's a good thing you're strong. I think you'll be the perfect base. As awful as it was, Izuku's tongue seemed to be frozen, locked away where he couldn't access it. He couldn't force his jaw open and he couldn't make his vocal cords move. That held true as the doctor grabbed a syringe and held it in his line of sight. This is a paralytic. Don't be alarmed when you can't move your body. Izuku panicked as the man fiddled with the 4-line. He couldn't see what was going on, so he braced himself. Nothing could have prepared him for what came next. The first thing he felt was a heaviness. Not the heaviness that came with a sedative but rather what came from the absolute loss of control of his body. He couldn't move his fingers anymore. It was getting difficult to blink. His chest became tight, like there was a boulder on him that he just couldn't manage to life. His eyes closed and he couldn't force them back open. No, 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 he thought. He couldn't see, but he could still hear. He could still feel. It's all right, don't panic. This is normal. In about 20 seconds, you won't be able to breathe. It won't be for long, the doctor told him. Izuku began counting down the seconds. As soon as he hit 15, his lungs stuttered like an old car and he couldn't manage to pull in any air. To say he felt panic was an understatement. He wasn't panicking, he was thrashing in his mind, screaming and begging for mercy. Yet on the outside, he was a stone statue. He wondered if that was what it was like to die. He heard footsteps and then hands were touching the sides of his face, his jaw. Izuku wondered if it was possible to hyperventilate when he couldn't even breathe. I'm going to intubate you and breathe for you. The hell he was. Those hands opened his mouth and something was quickly inserted in, aggressively hitting the back of his throat. He felt a tube jointed, sliding down his throat and through his vocal cords. It wasn't the first time he'd been intubated. Every surgery he knew that was what they did, but he'd never had it done while awake, while he could feel every movement and awful choking that came with it. But then air entered his lungs and he was breathing. Well, he wasn't breathing. Something was breathing for him. He found it hard to care when it was delivering oxygen. I can't have you fully sedated, unfortunately for you. It might change the outcome of the experiment. The doctor paused. Also, I don't want to. There was no peace as he laid there. He felt nothing but terror and horrible anticipation. And the worst was yet to come. The doctor said nothing for many long minutes. He felt the man touch his hand, his wrist, undoing the strap on that arm so he could move it. The only sound in the room was the wheezing from what he assumed was a ventilator behind him, keeping him alive. The doctor didn't warn Izuku before he started cutting. As soon as the blade entered his skin, Izuku wanted to scream. He wanted to pull away and jam that knife into the man's neck. But no, he remained completely silent and perfectly still. A slab of meat, that was what he was. Pain was not something he was unaccustomed to. After all the broken bones he's endured, he was a pro. But the doctor was delivering a new kind of hell, a new kind of pain. The doctor slowly cut through flesh and muscle, tendons and ligaments and nerves. Blood, hot and slick, pooled under his hand. When he felt the scalpel scrape against the bones in his hands, he screamed inside. It seemed to go on for days, an eternity of cutting and muttering and pulling. He was chained to a body that could do nothing but lay there and accept his fate. He was thankful when he passed out, though he still heard the squelch of gore and the thump of his hand on the table, having falling away from his uplifted arm. XXX. It's only been a day, Detective Kimura had said an hour ago. It had been in an attempt to stop Shota from killing himself with guilt, beating himself over the head with it. Only a day. Only a day. Only a day. A day was too long. A day, 24 hours, 1,440 minutes. One day. All that time spent enduring who knew what. Since Shota had sat with Ms. Midoriya, he'd spoken to his Class 3A. It had not gone well. In the end, he'd chosen to keep the details of Izuku's kidnapping from them. For the moment, all they needed to know was that he'd been attacked and taken during his patrol and efforts were currently underway in order to find him. It wouldn't be long before they found out the truth, though. Many of his students had work studies with heroes in the area. Those same heroes had been asked to help find Midoriya. He didn't know what he was going to do then, but it had been less than a day since he told them and he was already getting pestered by his students about the situation. Predictably, Bakugo and Todoroki were the most pushy about it. They wanted details. They demanded to help. He told them no on both counts. They couldn't be near the situation. It was 2 hours later that he received a call from Detective Kimura. Shota was perched on the edge of a roof, patrolling around the area Midoriya was taken from. He knew it was useless, but he had no idea where to start. It was all he could think to do. Eraser, we may have a lead, the detective told him, an undercurrent of excitement coloring his voice. Shota immediately hung up and ran to the station, bursting through the doors less than 5 minutes after he heard those words. He ran to the man's desk and slapped his hands on its surface. Tell me everything. Detective Kimura smiled tightly. We've been combing through the footage around the area to try and find the doctor. I found footage of him going inside the bank. Did you get the name he's using? Shota asked quickly. The detective grinned wryly. Come on, who do you think I am? Of course I got the name. He's going by Haruto Sasaki. I ran the name and found a home attached to it. The home is in a quiet neighborhood nearby. I looked into it and found this. He handed a file to Shota, who eagerly grabbed it. His brows furrowed as he read. When he looked up at the detective, he asked, a vet used to live here? Like, veterinarian? Exactly. Apparently, the previous owner converted the basement to a temporary clinic when the clinic he was working at was damaged from a villain fight. The detective reached up and gently tapped the file Shota held. I reached out to him and got some details about the house. When he sold it to Haruto Sasaki, he left it as is. Mr. Sasaki told the previous owner he was also a veterinarian and planned on using it as such. Shota rocked back on his heels. It would have all the equipment he would need to work down there, he whispered in horror. The detective nodded. We're raiding the place tonight. I've already contacted the team and a few heroes. Figured you'd want in on it too. Of course he wanted to be there. If Midoriya was there, he wanted to be the one to bring him back. He had to be the one to bring him back. The wait was the worst part of it all. Midoriya could be there, suffering, while Shota drank stale coffee and stared at the clock. When the time finally came to move out, he ran with energy in his steps. The assault team that would go in. First, Shota and two other heroes on their tails, was ready to break down the door before they even pulled up outside the home. One man looked over at Shota and nodded respectfully. I don't know Midoriya personally, but I know what he did for all of us. I know what part he played. We're going to do our best, Eraser. That meant a lot. What meant more was the actions they took to jump out of the police vehicle and break through the front door of the home. From the outside, the home was what Shota would expect to see a family living in. There was nothing that hinted at aggression or malice inside. A good cover for the doctor. Shota entered the home right behind the assault team. He took in the details of the home. The first hallway had a few photos hung, though none that had the doctor in them. They were photos that would be in a hotel lobby or a dentist office. The first floor was nothing special. A clean kitchen and living room. Dirty dishes in the sink and food in the fridge. A couch with a blanket thrown over the back. Nothing that screamed at Shota. He watched as the assault team split into two, one group going up the stairs to the top floor while the other went to the basement. He stood at the bottom of the stairs on the main floor and waited. The other heroes did the same, allowing them to do their jobs. Shota held his capture scarf, ready to strangle the doctor if they found him. He wasn't surprised when both groups said the place was clear. He wasn't surprised, but the disappointment and sorrow hit him like a truck. DMN it, he whispered, throat feeling tight once more. He was glad he hadn't told Ms. Midoriya about the possible lead, not that it was his place to do so. Eraser, you might want to come down here, Detective Kimura said, appearing at the top of the stairs to the basement. His expression did not help ease the nausea in his gut. Shota followed the man down the stairs, forcing his expression to remain neutral. He had to be logical. He was a hero and had seen terrible things. He could handle whatever was down there. Though, as he descended those stairs into the dark basement, he couldn't help but acknowledge the overwhelming urge to run. As soon as his feet hit the cold concrete floor, he knew he would never be able to get that basement out of his head. He would see it every time he closed his eyes, haunting him for far too long. There were dog kennels lining two walls. Large crates stacked too high with thick metal bars keeping whatever was inside from escaping. The smell of urine and blood hit him in full force and he covered his face in his capture scarf. The officers down there with him had moved back, allowing him to see everything. He wished they didn't do that. He wished they would tell him he couldn't be down there, that he had to remain upstairs and ignorant. There was a metal surgical table in the center of the room, leather restraints strategically placed along its surface where arms and legs and heads would go. Not of animals but of people. While the table itself was spotless, the floor underneath it was blood-stained. Droplets and dried puddles poorly cleaned. The cabinets behind the table were thrown open and tools were thrown on the counter, as if whoever had been down there had been looking for something and was in a hurry. Shota's eyes spotted a few wicked-looking tools he knew were used as surgical instruments and decided he was done looking. When he turned, he spotted 5 sets of chains embedded in the wall across the room. 5 sets of chains that were blood-stained and just low enough to allow wherever was held there to sit down. He's not here, Eraser, Detective Kimura said quietly. Midoriya wasn't there. Midoriya wasn't being held in those kennels or chained to the wall or strapped to that table. But Shota knew he was likely someplace else just like it. Monsters didn't suddenly change their techniques just because they moved. The doctor had been creating Nomu, which meant he was still experimenting on innocent people. He'd used that house, that basement, and gotten away with who knew what down there. Eraser stood stiff and frozen as the detective organized the officers and called in the forensic team. They would be able to identify the blood left behind. They'd be able to tell him if Midoriya was ever there. He almost wished the kid had never set foot down in that basement. If he'd never been there, then Shota hadn't been too late. Dreams were difficult to differentiate when the reality was a living nightmare. When Izuku opened his eyes, he didn't know if what he was experiencing was real. He was laying flat on his back, shoulder blades pressed uncomfortably against the metal table. His body was heavy, worse than before. It was as if it was filled with cement and had been left to dry. It didn't take long for the pain to seep into his consciousness. Slowly, like a thief in the night, sweat began to bead on his brow and his wrist began to throb, then ache and then burn. It was torture, lightning shooting up his arm and to his shoulder, finally finding its resting place in his brain. He almost didn't want to look. He knew it made him a coward, but he knew he wouldn't like what he found. He remembered everything, though he was unsure if what he remembered was a dream he'd conjured up or was every sick and twisted thing the doctor did to him. "Look at your hand. Your hand. Your hand." He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He was a hero student. He was nearly a hero, only a few months away from walking out of UA's gates with his license in hand. He could do this. So he lifted his head and stared down at his arm, trailing the length of his arm as it began to tremble. For one moment, as he stared at what lay below his wrist, he couldn't quite figure out what he was seeing. It was a hand, but it wasn't his. It was attached to him, but it wasn't him. It was the Nomo's hand, the one the doctor had brought close enough to tear out Izuku's guts. The Nomo's hand lay at the end of his arm, sewn onto his wrist by a ring of sutures, like a terrible bracelet. It was purple, a deep indigo that was jarring compared to his own skin tone. Each finger was tipped in a long, wickedly sharp claw. His breath sped and the edges of his vision began to darken. Distantly, he recognized he was panicking, that he needed to calm down and face the situation rationally. But that part of his brain was grossly overwhelmed by the sight of a Nomo's hand attached to his arm. His hand was gone. The doctor had cut his hand off. Tears escaped the corners of his eyes and he sobbed through clenched teeth. He couldn't lose it. He couldn't let this break him. Over and over again, he reminded himself that. Yet, he couldn't take his eyes off the hand. He couldn't ignore the pain, persistent and biting. He couldn't ignore the voice in his head that whispered in his ear. You can't be a hero with only one hand. And more importantly, Izuku trembled with the need to escape, to run and find someone he felt safe with, someone who would make it all better. The door to the room opened and the doctor entered. The Nomu was nowhere to be seen. Izuku didn't think he could have taken it if the creature came in with the man. "You're awake. Excellent. I have high hopes for this experiment. Your body held up better than the others." The doctor came to Izuku's side, not bothering to look at him before turning his eyes to the hand. The Nomo hand. No signs of infection, though it's still early on in the process. The man hummed under his breath. That was when he finally looked up at Izuku and seemed to notice his panic for the first time. "Calm down. This is just the first step. I'm taking it slow, so no need to work yourself up." The doctor turned away, moving around behind him before returning with a small machine. Izuku recognized it, a portable monitor. Nothing dangerous, just vital signs. He actually let out a sigh of relief as the doctor began hooking him up to it. "The last time I jumped straight to the big parts, my base didn't last long." Izuku squeezed his eyes shut tightly. Maybe for one moment he could ignore what was happening. Pretend everything was okay. The heroes were going to find him. It was only a matter of time before they came bursting through the door. He was fooling himself and he knew it. "Your hand," the doctor shouted, dragging Izuku back from his thoughts. Well, that and the scalpel that was suddenly embedded in his thigh. Izuku yelped, eyes flying open. "Move your hand. Now." Izuku tried, though it made him sick just thinking about it. Unfortunately, he couldn't feel anything below his wrist. He couldn't figure out where the controls for his fingers were. He gritted his teeth in terror and frustration. The doctor jammed the scalpel back in his leg, making Izuku cry out. "Move it. I'm trying, you dumb bastard." Izuku shouted right back. He went still, eyes behind those glasses pinned on the offending body part. He lifted the scalpel again and Izuku braced for more pain, but nothing came. Izuku dared to look back at the doctor and nearly vomited as he found the scalpel cutting through the Nomo's hand, thunking against the metal table below. "You don't feel that," the doctor whispered, face going slack. It wasn't a question. He sounded sad. Defeated. Izuku didn't feel the need to answer. A few shuffling steps and the doctor backed away from Izuku's side, shaking his head slowly. He was muttering to himself too quietly for Izuku to hear, but that didn't last long. The doctor suddenly threw the scalpel in his hand and it went flying, slamming into the wall with a soft clang. "Damn it. It's a failure. A failure. How could this have happened? I did everything right." The man paced the room, hands fluttering around him like nervous butterflies. "I was sure I attached everything correctly. I know I did. I took my time. I started small." He continued pacing the room, shaking his head and waving his hands around. Izuku clamped down on the trembling that had begun or he tried. "It's a failure. I can't stand failures," the doctor screamed, louder and more desperate than before. Izuku spotted the small hatchet half a second before the doctor did. He could do nothing out of shock and because of the restraints as the man grabbed the hatchet took 4 rapid steps to the side of the table. His arm was swinging down before either of them truly understood what was happening. The pain didn't hit him immediately. It was likely only a second after the offending hand had been severed, but it felt like he was holding his breath and waiting for the agony to register for far too long. An entire eternity. And when it hit? He screamed, air coming from deep in his chest. His throat went raw from it. He didn't even know where the doctor had made impact. All he knew was it hurt. All he knew was he needed the pain to stop or he just knew he was going to die. The doctor was shouting something at Izuku, but he couldn't make it out. He couldn't stop the screaming. He couldn't force the ringing out of his ears or the tears from his eyes. It only worsened when the doctor jerked a tourniquet tight around the end of what was left of his arm. He was too separated from the situation to notice the doctor grab a syringe and inject it into his foreline. "Let's see what wonders your brain creates, shall we?" Disappointment. Utter disappointment. The man trailed off as he left the room, shooting daggers back at him before shutting the door. XXX. At the end of his second year at UA, Izuku's mom had sat him down in their living room and begged him to quit. She'd cried as she made the request, which made Izuku cry. "I know I'm a terrible mother for asking this of you," she'd bawled, bowing her head in shame, "but I can't bear to watch you get hurt anymore. Before, it was this new quirk. Then it was everything with the League. I don't know if I can take you getting hurt as a hero." If she'd begged him even 3 years earlier, he might have given in. But since being at UA, Izuku had grown. In strength. In will. In courage. He knew he wasn't fearless, but he now understood being a hero wasn't about the absence of fear. So he'd reached out and touched her shoulder, drawing her eyes up to his. He'd smiled sadly, knowing he was taking a step in a new direction. "I can't quit, Mom. I can't stop now. I know you're scared for me. I know it won't be easy on you, but I need you to be strong for me so I can be strong for others. I've always had you in my life pushing me forward, supporting me. There are some people who don't have that. I want to be there for them. So, no, I won't quit." The two had cried together after that, but she never begged him to leave the hero world behind again. He was glad he didn't have to gather the strength to tell her no again. But lying there on that table, the doctor long gone and his mind swirling, he wondered if he should have listened to her. Though, after a second of considering he knew he wouldn't have done any of it differently even if he'd known what was coming. Because he'd known, even before the League, that the life of a hero was a risky one. That heroes could always run into trouble they didn't know how to get out of. Being a hero was always worth the risk. But he'd always assumed he'd make it to graduation. He choked down a sob. He couldn't think like that. He was going to make it. He had to make it. As if the world was against, the door to the room opened as soon as he allowed himself that comforting thought. He expected to see the doctor, those beady eyes glaring down at him. Yet, it was the Nomo who walked in. Izuku's brows came together as he watched that creature come forward, slowly entering the room like a scared animal. It looked as if it hadn't even noticed Izuku was there. In a sudden movement, though, it whipped its head around and stared at him on the table, its one clawed hand flexing at its side. It turned fully to face him and stopped, tilting its head as its eyes looked him over. Then it ran, drawing a flinch from Izuku. It practically appeared at Izuku's side, raising its claws high before swiping them through the air, aiming for Izuku's exposed stomach. The restrained teen screwed his eyes shut and let out a yelp. He waited. Waited for the pain to hit, to realize he'd been disemboweled by a Nomu. But nothing came. After a long moment, he opened his eyes. There was nothing there. No blood. No wounds. No Nomu. Nothing. The room was as empty as it had been when the doctor vacated his presence. "I'm hallucinating," Izuku murmured, fear crawling up his spine like spiders. A hallucinogen, likely, though he couldn't recall the doctor giving him anything. Possibly in the 4 bag that never seemed to get empty. Whatever it was, he knew he wasn't simply losing his mind. He was scared and tired and in pain, but he wasn't so far gone that he'd start hallucinating without additional chemical assistance. "Go to sleep. Sleep it off," he commanded himself, closing his eyes and begging his mind to go quiet. It didn't work very well. Between the throbbing, sharp pain in his arm and up his shoulder and the constant whispering voice that told him he needed to escape, sleep was kept far away. He thought he might have grabbed a few hours of sleep. Maybe. When he opened his eyes, he couldn't tell how much time had passed, but he didn't feel overly rested. There weren't any windows in the room and the doctor didn't seem inclined to start feeding him once a day, so those clues were inconveniently missing. As he took stock of himself, he lifted his hands and ran them down his face, sighing into his palms. It was only when his breath hit his skin that he realized his arms were free of their restraints. He jerked upright, sitting up on the table. His legs were also free, for whatever reason. It didn't take him more than a second to leap off the table, staggering as he got his bearings. The foreline was still connected to his arm, but he ripped it out, uncaring how the sight bled. What was a little blood when he was facing escape? He tried using his quirk, but it was still held just out of reach. No matter, he could do quite a lot without his quirk. Escape being one of them. He looked around, eyes lighting up as he spotted a small but wickedly sharp knife on the nearby counter. He shuddered as he saw blood left on the blade, unsure if it was his own or someone else's. Izuku crouched by the door and tested the knob. It was unlocked, and he slowly peeked through the crack as he pushed it open. He found a dark space, some kind of storage room? No Nomu and no doctor. Whatever else was out there didn't matter. Without those obstacles, he threw open the door and ran as fast as he could. Finding another door was a challenge, but he did it. He paused just long enough to peer through the door after opening it a crack. Cool air hit him in the face and he breathed in the fresh scent. Freedom. The restraint he had on himself vanished and he couldn't help but burst through the door out of the building. He was leaving it behind. The doctor. The Nomu. That DMN room. His bare feet hit the asphalt, but he hardly felt it. He ran and ran with what little strength he had, a massive smile adorning his face. It was nearly 4 blocks later that he stopped, ducking around a corner and catching his breath. It was only when he braced his hands on his hips and worked on slowing his breathing that he stopped and realized something wasn't quite right. His hands. Both of his hands. No. No, no, no. His heart sunk as lifted his hands and stared at the palms. That wasn't right. He knew the doctor had, he couldn't bear to remind himself of the details. But he knew he didn't have his left hand any longer. Yet there it was, unscathed and with all the familiar scars. It's not real. His shoulders slumped in defeat and turned, looking around. It looked real. It felt real. But maybe it was to protect himself or maybe his mind was finally snapping, but the buildings around him began to crumble and fall away to dust. The tears that fell down his cheeks were real, though. The sobs that made his chest ache were real. Izuku fell to the ground, hands pulling at his hair. I just want to leave, he sobbed. I just want to leave. His eyes squeezed shut, wishing, praying for all of it to be one big nightmare. He would wake up in his bed at the dorms. He would see his classmates and smile and pretend he hadn't been tortured all night by something that wasn't real. He would go to class and see his teacher, the teacher who was gruff and seemed harsh sometimes but was truly a hero to all those teenagers. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself staring at the dusty rafters above. Lying flat and restrained on the metal table, cold against his exposed skin. He was a future hero. He'd endured wounds and wore plenty of scars. He knew pain and suffering. But then and there, lying on that table, it was too much. It was all too much. His sobs shook his entire body and he couldn't stop the tears that pooled under his head. Then and there, he begged to be saved. He begged anyone out there to find him, to save him before it was too late. He didn't know what the doctor had in store for him, but he knew he wouldn't survive it. 4 days. It had been 4 days and Shota was on the verge of losing his mind. He didn't think he'd slept more than a few hours since he found out Midoriya had been taken. It was all he'd allowed himself with his student out there, enduring who knew what. 4 days. He'd been with the doctor for 4 days. Shota hadn't heard any of the officers or the detective on the case say it, but he knew they thought Midoriya was already dead. After all, they'd seen that basement. They knew what kind of things the doctor did. He treated people like his personal toys and used them until they broke. That morning, there weren't any classes since it was Sunday. That morning, he stood in front of Class 3, as dorm building and took several deep breaths as he prepared himself for the conversation ahead. He hadn't told them the details of the case yet. He'd been hesitant to do so. In fact, he had adamantly refused to clue them in. But that had been before. Since Midoriya had been kidnapped, Shota had been in constant contact with the investigating team, Detective Tsukachi, and Nizu. They had all agreed that telling the students was a step too far for the moment. Until the days began to add up and Midoriya still wasn't found. The heroes in the area all received memos that morning about the case. The memo detailed the importance of time, all but telling the heroes that if Midoriya wasn't found soon it was likely he would be turned into a Nomu or torn to pieces by the SDST that had been evading them for too long. Shota had just been in Nizu's office, torn about the decision he'd come to. Because with the local heroes pulled into the investigation, it was likely his students would hear the gory details while on their work studies. It was only a matter of time before they ended up reading the memo, or some careless intern gossiped about the missing student in front of them. Knowing his class, they would take their frustrations out in the field and get injured or worse. He wanted to break the news in a controlled environment. He was dreading it, which was why he'd been standing in front of their building for the last hour. The underground hero huffed a breath and climbed the stairs. Like a band-aid. He needed to tell them. Rip it off quickly. He just knew those DMN kids were going to react badly. But then, he wasn't any better than they were. Everyone to the common area. Now, he said loudly, drawing everyone's attention. Most students were in the kitchen or already in the common area watching a movie. He shut it off as he waited for the rest to join them. Shinso was the last to descend the stairs, brows coming together as he took in Shota's somber expression. Before I say what I need to say, I need you all to prepare yourselves. What I'm going to say isn't pleasant and I'm only telling you because you'll likely find out during your work studies. He closed his eyes and sighed. When he opened them again, he found every set of wide eyes pinned on him, waiting. As you know, Midoriya was taken 4 days ago. He was kidnapped while on patrol and has not yet been found. What we didn't tell you was who took him. Here it was. Here was the worst of it. Telling Midoriya's classmates. Another deep breath. The students visibly flinched as he said, Midoriya and the hero he was with were attacked by Nomu. The hero, Bullet, was killed. Midoriya was taken. We discovered he was taken by the doctor. We followed up on several leads, but come up with nothing. Absolute silence. All he could hear was his own heartbeat in his ears. Thump, 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 far too fast. The first tear that fell was from Ashido. Her hands covered her mouth and silent tears streamed down her face. It seemed to be the feather that broke the camel's back because as soon as she began crying everyone else lost it. Some cried, some went silent. Others asked questions and gasped out exclamations in shock. Shota noted that Bakugo's eyes were impossibly wide and he'd gone still. Mr. Aizawa, Ashido gasped, finally pulling her hands away from her lips. What does this mean? Midoriya, what does this mean for him? He knew she wasn't stupid. In the back of her mind, she already knew. Just as her classmates already knew. But for some reason she needed confirmation. It's not good, he answered. I'll be blunt and honest because I know you all can handle it. I want you to brace yourself for the worst because that is what we're facing. He ran his fingers through his hair and winced at the greasiness. He needed to shower. It's likely Midoriya is being tortured or experimented on by the doctor. Time is of the essence. Those who didn't have tears in their eyes began crying at his words. He didn't want to hurt them. He didn't want them to cry. But they needed to know what might happen. It would be easier for them in the end. If the worst happens. If Midoriya is found dead or never found at all. Those thoughts he kept to himself. They did no one any good. At this point, I'm telling you this only so you don't hear it from someone else. If it weren't for that possibility, I wouldn't be telling you at all. But don't mistake me telling you this as me asking for your help. At this point, you students are not to be involved in the investigation. Even if the heroes you're working with are involved, he added. There were a few outraged cries. Strangely enough, Bakugo had yet to utter a word, staring at Shota with an intense fire in his eyes. Shota held up a hand and they went silent. Believe me when I tell you, I understand how you're feeling. If I were in your position I would want to be involved. But you can't be. PRD. Do you all understand? The students nodded. Uraraka grabbed Ashido's hand and the two clung to each other tightly. Shota's heart broke at the sight. Those students had wormed their way into his heart since they'd been assigned to his class. From day one, they had all been trouble magnets, Midoriya more so than the others. He had watched them fight during the war and learned to cope with everything that had happened afterward. Time and time again, he had stood on the sidelines and watched his students grow stronger and push past what he thought they would be able to handle. Too many times, they had surpassed his expectations. If Midoriya was never found? If Midoriya was found? Shota didn't know if he would ever recover. XXX. It was later that day that Nizu called Shota into his office. When the man stepped inside and shut the door behind him, he found Hisashi already seated across from Nizu. Please, take a seat, Shota, Nizu said. Shota narrowed his eyes at Hisashi, silently asking him what the hell he was doing there. The other man simply shrugged. I have been thinking about your class. Particularly, their involvement in Midoriya's case, the principal started. What? Shota couldn't help but sit up in his seat, staring at Nizu like he was going insane. He very might well be. You want them involved? Maybe. Maybe not. I want to discuss the possibilities. Bullshit. Nizu knew exactly what he wanted to happen. He just wanted Shota to make him think it was his idea. With the doctor involved, I don't want them anywhere near this. Hisashi raised his hand sheepishly. Why am I here right now? Nizu smiled. You're helping the investigation, are you not? While it was true, Hisashi was one of the heroes looking for Midoriya, he wasn't doing anything more than the other heroes weren't. He said as much. I believe you have an insight into this situation. Shota narrowed his eyes. He suspected the real reason Hisashi was there was to help Nizu reason with the underground hero. That man had an uncanny ability to back him into a corner. Hisashi sighed, coming to the same conclusion Shota had come to. You want the students involved. I understand why, to an extent. They've been able to help us when we were out of leads in the past. Besides, they'll be heroes in a few short months anyway. It's not like their first years again. Oh, how Shota could kill him. Hisashi held up his hands in surrender as he caught Shota's glare. What? Are you telling me you disagree? Do you really think they'll sit on the sidelines and stay out of trouble? You think they won't get involved regardless of what we do? DMN. He was right. Shota wanted to believe his class would listen to him, but it was entirely possible they were already trying to figure out ways to save Midoriya. Their past record told him all he needed to know about their predicted actions. They were hero students, they couldn't stand by while others saved someone close to them. Though, as his teacher it was giving him gray hairs. Shota bowed his head in thought. When he lifted it, he rubbed at his tired eyes. Let's say we let the students get involved. If we were to allow this, there would be conditions. Of course. Nizu looked far too pleased with himself. What do you have in mind? What did he have in mind? Bubble wrapping his students and locking them away until they graduated. He was getting too old for this. While on patrol, they stick with their assigned hero at all times. No running off on their own. When we get our next lead and recover Midoriya, because they would be finding him, whoever wants to be involved will be by my side or with other heroes. They will not be by themselves. Nizu nodded along with him. I expected nothing less. Hisashi smiled apologetically at Shota. Traitor. However, he reasoned that it made sense. He'd told his class about the case because he needed them to think through their actions. Better to keep them close to his side than let them loose and unsupervised, he supposed. Midoriya, complicating things once again, Shota muttered, shaking his head. He rose and headed to the door. Where are you going? Hisashi asked, standing. Where do you think? You all want my students involved. He threw his hands up and stormed out of Nizu's office. XXX. You're letting us join? Uraraka asked hesitantly. But you told us this morning. Shota growled under his breath. Yeah, well, you all are predictable and I don't trust you to stay out of trouble. It wasn't my choice, but here we are. After telling them, they were hesitantly joyful. He immediately worked to stifle that emotion. Nothing about the situation was joyful. If you are going to be joining us and I need you to understand that you don't have to, you need to understand there is the possibility you may be forced to see your classmate in a terrible condition. There is the possibility he is already dead. There is the possibility we will get there too late. I know this may sound like I don't care, but I assure you I do. He braced his hands on his hips and looked them each in the eye. You have all been through plenty since starting at UA. You've survived more than anyone could ever ask you to survive. I want you to go into the hero world and make a difference, to do your best. That is a part of the job of a hero. But being knee-deep in horror is also the job of a hero. So I apologize for being cruel, but I need you each to understand exactly what could happen. From the looks on their faces, his words were sinking in. Believe me when I tell you this, I understand how you're feeling. I lost a classmate when I was in school and have lost other heroes I considered friends. So while I need you to prepare yourself for the worst, don't allow yourself to lose hope. He didn't linger long. He was exhausted and needed to take a long shower. After, he could go back on patrol. After, he would touch base with Detective Kimura and see if there were any new leads. He knew there wouldn't be. Many of the students were crying when he left, but their classmates were already well on their way to comforting them. He felt comfortable leaving them in capable hands. Even if they were just teenagers. Though, as soon as he made it to the front steps, the door opened and Ashido stepped out. He paused, turning to look at her. Mr. Aizawa, please wait, she called out quietly. She was still crying, tears running down her cheeks. She came to stand at the top off the steps beside him, not looking at him but rather at the lawn ahead. You know, I took Midnight's death hard after the war. I know you did too. A pain in his chest as he remembered his friend's face, her limp body in death, her funeral. He and Hisashi had attended it together, standing away from the rest of the mourners. He missed her, despite having been annoyed by her antics. She was one of those heroes he'd lost. Ashido swallowed hard. I can't lose Midoriya, she whispered. I can't take any more loss. And I know that makes me weak and... He stopped her. He had thought those exact thoughts before. As a student. When he was a new hero. After learning of Midoriya's kidnapping. He'd burdened himself with those exact thoughts and didn't want Ashido to follow in his footsteps. He grabbed her and pulled her into a tight hug. She didn't hesitate to wrap her arms around him in return. You are not weak, he told her. We're going to find him. We'll find him. He was convincing himself. While Ashido had been bold enough to admit her fears, he carried the same ones. He didn't know if he could lose a student. He didn't know if he was strong enough to lose Midoriya. XXX. This was hell. It was some universal punishment. It had to be. Izuku had long since passed hungry. He was empty. Weak. A husk of who he used to be. On the verge of giving up. After only a few days. Or maybe it had been longer. Weeks. Months. Maybe even a year. He didn't know. The doctor had come in and pushed hallucinogens through his for more than once, warping reality. He could have sworn he had just escaped that place, broken out of that room with his quirk intact. The doctor had left the four out, forgotten to put it back in. Then he'd opened his eyes and found himself staring at those rafters above. Time meant nothing. And when time lost its meaning, how was he supposed to stay strong? How was he supposed to pretend he was still okay, that he was still fighting? At some point, the doctor had returned and stitched up the wound at the bottom of his arm. Izuku had mustered up the courage to look at it before it had been repaired and promptly gagged on what he found. Before, it had been the Nomo hand up to his wrist. But after the doctor took a hatchet to it, he'd cut off more than just Izuku's wrist. From his mid-forearm down, empty space. The end of his arm had been broken bone and torn flesh. Not a clean cut. The doctor had made it a clean cut later, all while Izuku was awake, of course. Now, it was stitched shut. The pain was familiar now. It made it hard to sleep, if what he did could be called sleep. He drifted, more like. His stomach, empty and shriveled, quietly reminded him he needed to eat. He ignored it. The doctor had been giving him fluids through the four, so he knew he would be okay for a little bit longer. He could survive without food, though it was unpleasant. When the door to the room opened, Izuku flinched against the table. That sound haunted him even when the doctor wasn't there, metal against metal, scraping and rusted hinges. The doctor came to his side quickly, looking him over once before speaking. How are we feeling? I must say, you're doing remarkably well. Izuku didn't reply. He didn't have words to waste and was too tired to try. The doctor didn't seem to mind. I'm curious. Others before you have withered away and died in the same conditions. But not you. Interesting indeed. It's possible it's the quirk that has changed your body. Made it stronger, more durable. The man put his hand to his chin and thought. Yes, that must be it. That quirk has made you an exceptional specimen. The doctor turned on his heel and walked away, but Izuku knew it wasn't over. The doctor's presence meant pain. He knew that fact as much as he knew the sky was blue. It didn't take long for the man to return, but when he came into Izuku's line of sight, the teen's stomach clenched with fear. He wore a surgical mask and gown and was putting on his sterile gloves. Izuku panicked, knowing what was to come. Well, not knowing, but the gown and mask couldn't bring anything but pain. He couldn't shy away from the doctor as the man hooked him up to the portable monitor once more, tooting at Izuku's fear. You might be the key to my most spectacular creation. Isn't it wonderful? The doctor asked with a massive grin. Izuku's breath stuttered. You're a sick bstrd. The man paused, glaring down at him. He didn't reply, only moved to gather his tools. He pulled a table closer, tools clanging against its surface. Then he grabbed a syringe. No, please no, Izuku begged. Please don't do this. Not again. The doctor didn't listen. He grabbed the four-line and rapidly injected whatever was inside. Izuku had a feeling he knew what it was, and it was confirmed as soon as he felt his muscles seize and his lungs grow heavy. No. Not again. Please, not again. He begged for it to stop, for this to be a hallucination. He couldn't breathe. His heart began to increase speed, the only sign of his terror. The doctor came around him and angled his head back, quickly inserting a tube down his throat. It was just as unpleasant as the first time, but Izuku knew that wasn't the worst part. Of course, with the doctor, that wasn't the worst that could happen. The doctor closed Izuku's eyes and moved down to his leg. Such power, given to a child. What a waste, the man chided. Then he cut. All Izuku knew was agony. He couldn't focus on anything, not as he felt his skin open and the doctor's fingers underneath, pushing and touching and moving, intruding where they should never be. He wanted to scream, to vomit from the pain. He wanted to use his quirk and rip the doctor apart. He wanted to grind him into the concrete with his bare fists. He wanted the man to suffer. Izuku's heart fluttered like a wounded bird in his chest. Too fast. It was too fast. The doctor's hand stopped moving at Izuku's knee. There was a sickening squelch and then footsteps coming closer. Almost right in Izuku's ear, the man said, "You're being difficult." A long pause and then a curse. "Your heart is going too fast. I hope you're happy." Izuku didn't know what the doctor did, but it wasn't long before he felt too heavy, too tired to stay awake. It was a blessing. Though, as he spiraled downward, he could still feel the knife and the doctor's hand blazing against every nerve in his body. It was a week after Midoriya went missing that a lead practically fell into their laps. Nizu had given Shota the rest of the week off, understanding that he was no good to his students while worrying about the one who was still missing. He'd only been back to his room at UA once in the last few days, instead spending every waking moment at the station and on patrol. Nothing. Not a hint of Midoriya. Shota was losing hope. However, each time he thought about giving up or let those traitorous thoughts in, he pictured Ashido's face, her shaking words. He pictured the rest of his problem class and what the loss of Midoriya would do to them. It would be catastrophic. It would destroy them. It was early that morning that he received a call from Tsukachi. He answered on the second ring, nearly throwing his phone off the roof he stood on in his rush to get it out of his pocket. "Do you have any news?" Shota asked quickly. There was a sigh. "Technically, yes. Come to the station and we can see what this uncovers." Then he hung up, leaving Shota standing there with wide eyes. If Tsukachi wasn't bursting with joy, it meant what they found wasn't Midoriya. He made it to the station in 10 minutes, coming through the doors while he huffed and fought to catch his breath. Tsukachi was standing behind Detective Kimura at his desk, pointing to the screen and speaking rapidly. He stopped as soon as he saw Shota. "What did you find?" Shota asked, coming to stand beside Tsukachi. He raised his brows as he saw a paused video on Detective Kimura's computer screen. It was blurry, but he knew who that was. "That's the doctor." "Where is this?" Tsukachi crossed his arms. "Let Kimura explain." The man turned in his chair to face Shota. "I reached out to everyone I know and had them start looking for the doctor in their own cities. A friend of mine in Yamanashi found this footage. Watch." He restarted the video from the beginning. Shota could tell the footage was inside a bank, only a few other people in the frame. He watched as the doctor entered the building and walked up to the teller. The camera changed angles and showed the doctor from behind. There wasn't any audio, which was unfortunate. The doctor finished his business and left, just another person in the stream of people. My friend went to the bank himself and managed to get the name the doctor used. Tachibana Hideki. Detective Kimura smiled grimly. Shota wanted to let his hope run wild, but he tamped down on it. "Did you find an address connected to that name?" Tsukachi put a hand on Shota's shoulder. "We did. It's in Yamanashi." Detective Kimura pulled up a map and zoomed in until it was only a single street. "This right here is a warehouse that is on the record to store office furniture. It hasn't been used in years. However, the strange thing is that a few days ago a shipment of medical equipment was ordered and shipped there. Signed by the one and only Tachibana Hideki, the same name on the lease for the property. A warehouse. An order of medical equipment. The doctor's alias tied to the address. It was a lead. It was something. He might be held there," Shota breathed staring at the warehouse. Both detectives nodded. "Then we need to go there. Now." Tsukachi put out a hand to stop Shota. "We're already on it. We've already contacted the heroes in that area and a few here who can be there for a raid tonight. And you, I assume." Of course. He was going to be there for Midoriya. His mind was racing as he began thinking through the possibilities. That night, they were going to go to that warehouse. They were going to tear it apart until they found Midoriya. He had to be alive. He had to be. Shota was going to get that kid out. He was going to bring him home. He stopped himself, coming back to a detail he'd skipped over. "What was in the shipment?" "You said it was medical equipment." Detective Kimura searched the piles of paper and files on his desk before he came up with the list. "Oxygen bottles, oxygen tubing, scalpels, it looks like other surgical equipment, but truthfully I have no idea what some of these things are for." The man handed him the list. Shota skimmed it quickly, but he also had no idea what those were used for, nor did he ever want to know. He handed the list back and nodded once. "I need to get back to UA and talk to Nizu, but send me the details." Tsukachi clapped him on the shoulder before he left, smiling knowingly. "I'll see you and your kids tonight." DMN. The kids. He'd almost forgotten. XXX. Tonight. That's quick, Nizu said. Shota moved the phone to his other ear as he walked as quickly as he could without technically running. It is, but the quicker the better. We don't want him getting away from us just because we dragged our feet. I agree, it was just an observation. Are you going to tell your students now? Did he want to? No. What he wanted to do was go to the raid without them and face the consequences later, but there were several of his students who likely already knew about the raid. A few of the local heroes who had been brought in by the detectives had his students at their agency. It was a pain. I'm headed there now. Are we sure we want them involved? Are you sure you want them there? He wanted to ask, but held his tongue. Before he knew it, he was at UA, standing in front of their dorm building once more. That time, he didn't hesitate before going in. He didn't have the time to hesitate. Thankfully, Hizashi had been in charge of teaching that day and sent them all to their dorm until lunch for a massive study hall, a move Shota would later berate him for. However, it made it convenient for him to call them all to the common area. As I'm sure some of you know, there is a raid scheduled for tonight. Now, there is no guarantee Midoriya will be there, but there is a possibility. I understand you all want to save him, and I won't discourage you from doing so, but I want you to know it isn't required for you to go. He scanned the room, seeing smiles and hopeful expressions instead of tears. He sighed. He'd already warned them of what might happen and he wasn't about to do it again. If you don't want to be involved in this, there's no shame in that. Does anyone not want to participate? Predictably, no one raised their hand. Fine. In that case, I have several rules that you will follow. PRD. If you think I won't expel you over breaking them just because you're almost heroes, you're wrong. He made sure they were all listening before he continued. You will not be going off on your own during the raid. I have already split you up between myself and other heroes involved in the raid and you will stay by our sides like glue. No running off on your own. Additionally, you will obey every order given to you, even if you're asked to retreat or back off. We're in charge of your safety and will give you orders for your own safety. By the end of his talk with the students, they looked slightly less joyful, but there was still that spark of passion that he was relying on. However, he stopped 3 students from leaving the common area before he departed from the dorm building. Bakugo, Ashido, Todoroki, with me outside. He didn't wait to see if they followed before stepping outside. Thankfully, they went without a fuss. He turned to face them, finding Bakugo staring at him with an indignant expression, Todoroki with a neutral one, and Ashido practically buzzing with excitement. You 3 are with me during the raid. I know you 3 well enough to know no other hero can handle the energy you 3 are going to bring. You are all close to Midoriya, and I don't trust you to be with any other heroes. If they were with anyone else, it was likely they'd leave them in the dust the minute they left his sight. He shook his head, cursing them in his head. They were a pain. Until we leave, eat and sleep as much as you can. Tonight, you're going to be heroes. Shota turned on a heel and left them standing there. He needed as much peace and quiet as he could get before that night. He knew what was to come wouldn't be pleasant, even if they didn't find Midoriya. XXX. Izuku woke up to his own groaning, a whimpering that pierced his already aching brain. It wasn't just his arm anymore. It was everything, up his sides and wrapping around his chest and stomach. His neck and shoulders. All the way to his last remaining fingertips. Tears streamed from his eyes even before he was fully conscious. That kind of pain didn't allow him to breathe through it. He felt paralyzed, and even if he weren't strapped to that table he knew he wouldn't be able to move. The pain was overwhelming. He opened his eyes with a gasp, vision blurry and swaying. Whether it was residual drags in his system or the pain was breaking his pain, he didn't know. It felt as if he'd been torn apart and stitched back together. That was exactly what had been done. He managed to lift his head an inch and get a hazy view of what had been done. It wasn't pretty. Thick lines of sutures covered him from his chest to his toes, long, running lines where the doctor had cut him open inch by inch. They lit his body on fire, making it impossible to move without wanting to scream. He looked up at the 4 bag above him and begged for whatever sedation was inside to kick in. He didn't know what the doctor did to him, but the 4 line wasn't open. The clamp on the line was shut, cutting the liquid off from his arm. He stared at it, making sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. The doctor had forgotten to open the clamp? When? Why? He wasn't entirely sure it wasn't a hallucination. He'd seen it all before and though he'd escaped only to wake up right where he was. It wasn't as if he could move anyway, even without the drags the doctor was feeding him, the quirk suppressant. He didn't know how he would know if it was real, if he truly had a chance to escape. And honestly? He was tired. He was in pain. The thought of forcing himself to use his quirk and act made him whimper again. He didn't know how long he remained lying there, drifting in a sea of hurt, before the doctor came in. He didn't even greet Izuku before he was speaking. Amazing muscle capacity. Amazing. Truly, I've never seen a body like yours. The possibilities are endless. I have to believe it's the quirk that pushed you over the edge of resilience, but you had to have been that way before receiving it. The doctor began inspecting his work, staring at the lines he'd carved into Izuku's body. Izuku remained still up until the doctor touched an area on his thigh. It was as if the man had jammed a hot knife straight into the muscle and twisted. He screamed, back arching off the bed as much as the restraints allowed him to. Oh, don't be dramatic. All this pain is for science. Believe me, I will make you my best work yet. You won't even remember this pain when I'm done. The man paused, a hand on his chin. You may not remember anything, but that is just an added bonus. Izuku began crying once more, though not just because of the pain. He wanted out. He needed out. He wanted to go back to his dorm. He wanted to feel his mom's arms wrapped around him, reminding him he was safe. He wanted to be safe. He wanted to feel safe. The man's face loomed over his and he flinched back. You will be my new power. What a joyous day this is. He grinned, flashing his teeth at Izuku. Just as fast as he'd come, he disappeared from Izuku's sight. He shuffled around him, inspecting his work quickly and thankfully never touched Izuku. He was still dizzy from that first touch. I'm sure you're in pain, but I can't increase your dose. No, just yet. This will have to do until then. The man lifted a syringe, one Izuku was growing familiar with. He lifted it as if Izuku would be happy to see it. When he didn't get a reaction, the man frowned and went for the 4-line. Izuku held his breath as the man touched it, injecting the hallucinogen into the line. Then he moved away, not noticing the clamp still shut. Izuku held his breath, eyes wide. Was this a hallucination or had the doctor truly not noticed? I know how smart you are and I plan to take full advantage of it. If I can't have All for One and Shigaraki behind me, I will make my own force to be reckoned with. The doctor cackled to himself as he moved around the room. I will make the heroes regret ever coming against me. All the while, Izuku laid there and focused. He had to bank on the possibility that it wasn't a hallucination, that he was on the verge of a massive opportunity. He needed to think of an escape. He needed to escape. He would escape. The warehouse was massive. Shota couldn't take his eyes off of it, even from a block away. The thing dwarfed the other buildings around it, spanning an entire block. He was suddenly thankful the detectives had thought to bring in plenty of help, they'd certainly need it to clear the place. He scoffed, turning to look at his students. Storing office furniture. What a load of shit. Bakugo was crouched beside Todoroki, the former snarling insults at the other. Todoroki didn't look to be taking the insults to heart or even hearing them in the first place. Ashido was crouched behind Shota, appearing much more professional and ready. He nodded to her and she returned the action. They had been in position to engage for nearly an hour. Shota was going insane waiting for everyone else to get to their assigned positions. He was glad he wasn't in charge of the entire raid, but he was getting anxious with the pace they were taking. We're ready to engage. Shota put a hand over his ear over the comms. He came to alert, motioning for his students to get ready. Move in. I repeat, move in. Shota didn't need to be told twice. He leapt off the roof, trusting his students to follow. He kept to the shadows, moving as just another patch of darkness, and came to the warehouse. There was a window on the second floor and he climbed up the side of the warehouse using the few footholds he could find. A glance behind him and he was happy to find his students following his lead. Perfect. If nothing else, they could follow orders. All it took was a knife to jam the window open and he rolled over the sill, springing up with his blade out. As he waited for his students to come in behind him, he scanned the area. It was dark and he could hardly make out anything more than 10 feet ahead. It would be difficult to clear the entire warehouse. Not only were they going to have to go through the place without turning on the lights to maintain stealth, but there were 2 floors. For Midoriya. It was all for Midoriya. For now, stay close to me. I'll use my flashlight, but don't use yours just yet. The less light visible the better. He didn't need anyone raising an alarm just yet. Don't bother looking through any of the boxes. Rooms only. His 3 students nodded. Shota pulled out his flashlight and began searching for his missing student. The floor they were on was filled to the brim with pallets of office chairs and disassembled desks, though it was entirely likely that was not what was actually inside. Shota spotted a bundle of wires along the ceiling, winding its way around the rafters. He followed it. If the doctor was performing experiments, he needed electricity. Where there was electricity, there was the possibility of finding the doctor or Midoriya. Shota held up a hand to the students, bringing them to a halt. Long ago, he'd taught his class the most basic hand signals every underground hero knew by heart. It gave them the ability for wordless, silent communication. Thankfully, that was a lesson he'd pounded into their skulls. Room ahead. Possible enemy. Stay alert, he signed. Shota inched forward until his hand rested on the metal door handle. He couldn't hear anything inside, but that didn't mean much. He took in a few deep breaths to calm himself before pushing it open with an agonizing grind of metal on concrete. He entered the room, knife out and ready, and lifted the flashlight. His heart was practically thrown into his stomach and he blurted out, "Sheet." There, huddled in the center of the room, were at least a dozen Nomu. As soon as the light hit them, they all turned in unison, beady eyes immediately marking him. It was too late to run, and even if they had been able to, they wouldn't have. There, far too close, was the enemy. Behind him, Ashido found a light on the wall and flicked it on. The single overhead bulb flickered to life, illuminating the Nomu underneath. Several of them screeched, taking steps toward the group of heroes. "Don't get hurt. Take them down however you can," he instructed them. As if the Nomu understood what he'd said, there was another wave of cries from the creatures before they rushed toward the door. Shota saw Bakugo and Todoroki burst past him, quirks flaring to life. He ducked away from the sparks that began to fly and the ice that crackled around his feet, clashing with the first Nomu he could. However, it became abundantly clear that those two students of his were willing and able to take care of the Nomu without their teacher's help. Bakugo growled out a curse and shot up into the air, palms down. Shota's eyes shot wide and he ducked, grabbing Ashido and pulling her away from the room. He covered her with his body as the entire room exploded, shaking the entire building. Ice grabbed onto the remaining Nomu as Bakugo continued to let loose his quirk. In less than a minute, the explosions finally stopped and Shota looked over his shoulder. He found the entire room scorched and frozen, covered in parts of Nomu. Not a single intact Nomu to be seen. He stood in one motion and pointed to Bakugo. "What the hell? I said do what you had to do, but you could have killed us," he scolded the student. Bakugo rolled his eyes. "We stopped a problem before it became one. You should be thanking us." That was it. After the raid, Bakugo was grounded until he graduated. Shota narrowed his eyes and Bakugo had the good sense to appear remorseful. At least, as remorseful as he could get. Ashido brushed off the ash that had come to settle on her hair, nodding in appreciation at the state of the place. "Pretty good, Blasty." Bakugo brushed past her, glaring. It only made Ashido grin. XXX. Izuku was ashamed to admit it, but he fell asleep. He hadn't meant to. The last thing he remembered was keeping his mind focused on anything other than the pain. Because that was all he was feeling. Apparently, without the added buffer of the sedative through the 4, his injuries were almost unbearable. Yet he'd managed to fall asleep. If he were being truthful, he passed out. He was sweating and was dizzy with pain. It was only natural for his body to shut down on its own to spare him even a few minutes of agony. So as he opened his eyes, he clamped his teeth shut and tried to breathe through the waves of throbbing and burning from the new wounds. Every movement was torture. So instead of even trying, he focused deep inside himself. With his eyes closed, he searched for the last ray of hope he clung to, the only thing that could bring him home. And there it was. A spark of his quirk. Not yet returned in full force, but certainly enough to bring one for all to his fingertips. Enough to fuel one burst of energy. He gasped as power filled his veins, spreading to his arms, to his last remaining hand. Lightning flickered over his skin. What was that? Izuku turned to look toward the voice and found the doctor standing just inside the room with wide eyes. Two things happened at once. The doctor ran toward Izuku, clearly aiming for his 4-line. Izuku used one for all to break through the restraints keeping him on the table. As soon as Izuku was able to move, he swung himself over the edge of the table, feet hitting the floor. He screamed low with each movement, more and more sutures popped and ripped free. Blood flowed free and flew as droplets to his feet. But despite the pain, he knew he had to keep moving. He had to push past the dizziness and weakness. He had to get free. As soon as the doctor came within reach with a syringe in hand, Izuku's fist shot out and slammed into the doctor's chest, knocking him back. It wasn't backed by his quirk, he was completely drained after using it just once, but it was enough. Enough to buy him a moment to stumble past the man to the door. Until a hand grabbed onto his ankle and sent him careening to the floor. His chin hit the floor hard and split the skin. Blood burst from the wound and covered his hands as they came up to stop it. Already, the room was swaying around him and he was barely containing his wounded whimpers. His feet kicked at the floor uselessly in an attempt to get back up, to get moving. The doctor stood over him, the man's face shadowed in wrath. "You insolent brat," the man screamed, spit flying. He grabbed a fistful of Izuku's hair and jerked his head back. Izuku gagged, trying to pry the man's fingers away, but he didn't make it far. The doctor's fist smashed into his face twice in quick succession, finally releasing Izuku only when he went limp. He fell back to the floor, blood pouring from his nose, which he assumed was broken from the crack he'd heard. He spit onto the floor. He had to get up. He had to keep moving, to fight back. However, despite screaming at his body to move, he just couldn't muster up the strength. He was too weak from the blood loss, from the days and days of capture and constant torture, from the aching and throbbing and stabbing. He ended up slumped against the floor, back to the wall, as the doctor towered over him. He had been given the opportunity to escape and couldn't manage it. Some hero he was. The doctor leaned over him, rubbing at his chest. "You'll pay for that. You'll wish you were dead when I'm done with you." The man stood straight and looked toward the door. Nomu. It took a few seconds before the Nomu he was all too familiar with entered the room, coming to stand beside the doctor and only a few inches from stepping on Izuku. The hero student didn't know if the Nomu would even care if he did. Take him back to the table. Now. The Nomu didn't hesitate to follow the new direction. It bent and grabbed Izuku around the throat, lifting him in one motion. Izuku gagged, clawing at the creature's hand. He put up a good fight until the Nomu slammed him back down on the table, clawed hand keeping him there as it awaited more instructions. Izuku closed his eyes, giving up. The doctor would have him strapped down and hooked back up to the fore. In a moment, he would no longer have his quirk and he would be vulnerable once more. Escape impossible. His one chance wasted. Tears filled his eyes and fell. He was a failure. He wasn't worthy to be a hero any longer. Not when he couldn't even put up a good fight. Not when he couldn't even stand up straight. His eyes flew open as the building shook, an explosion echoing off the walls. What was that? The doctor whirled toward the door as if the answer would walk right in. As the explosions continued to sound, the man cursed and marched out of the room, shouting instructions to the Nomu. Strap the kid back on the table. Keep him on the table. The Nomu did as he was told, and once again Izuku found himself on the table, blood pooling underneath him. XXX. Since leaving the room full of Nomu which, frankly, was absolutely absurd, they were still having to deal with those BSTRDS after everything. Their huddled group was on edge. Extremely on edge. Shota's boot had made a small noise a minute ago and all three of his students had jumped. They were following the electric lines. It had worked out the first time. Sort of. Shota felt as if they'd been walking for hours, waiting to find more Nomu or Midoriya. The waiting was the worst part. Shota heard the footsteps first. He held out his hand and his student stopped with him. Yes, there, distantly, someone was running. As he listened, he realized the footsteps were coming their way, slowly growing louder with each passing second. There's someone coming. Prepare yourselves, he whispered, angling his flashlight down so it didn't show around the corner. He didn't know who was coming, but he knew it wasn't a Nomu and it wasn't anyone from the raid. He knew who it was before the man turned the corner. As soon as the doctor appeared, arms pumping as he moved as fast as he could, Shota stepped forward and slammed his palm into the man's face. It threw the doctor back on his butt, sliding a few feet. Shota towered over him, hands desperate to choke the man to death even as his brain told him he couldn't do that. Despite everything, he was still a hero. Instead of killing the man, he aimed his knife right at the man's bleeding nose and asked with a deadly tone, "Where is Midoriya?" The man at his feet trembled, though there was a blaze of fury in his eyes. Shota kicked the man in the ribs, earning a yelp, and asked again. "Where is Midoriya?" XXX. The Nomu standing at the foot of the table didn't seem to care as Izuku spoke to himself. It didn't hear how he cried or begged to be released. It didn't care how he struggled against the restraints. After a few minutes of struggling, Izuku stopped. All he wanted to do was lay there and forget about everything. Forget about how much he was bleeding. Forget about the pain. Forget about the doctor and the lab room. Forget about escape. For one terrible moment, Izuku didn't want to exist. He wanted everything to stop. Then he reminded himself why he couldn't. He was on track to become a hero. For people like him, for people like Eri. For people who begged to be saved and couldn't save themselves. He was the one who would be there. He reminded himself that he had people waiting for him. His mom. His classmates. His teacher. He knew there were others, but he was just so tired. He had to keep fighting. Even if he didn't want to. "Give me just a little more strength," he begged in a whisper. Just a little more. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He knew where to find his quirk, that spark that sat in the center of his chest. He knew what it felt like, what it had felt like since first receiving it. A spark that pulsed and skittered across his spine. A warmth that was like a single flame until he touched it, turning into a blaze. He knew he was fighting off what quirk suppressant was still in his system. He felt sluggish and uncoordinated as he reached for his quirk again. Exhaustion certainly didn't help. He was at the end of his rope, the end of his efforts. But he could act one more time. So when he opened his eyes, he saw green across his vision. For one single moment, he felt invincible again. It left him completely drained, however, after he sat up, snapping the restraints. He nearly fell back against the table and gave in to sleep. Instantly, the Nomu's eyes landed on him. It moved like a bolt of lightning, clawed hand reaching out. But Izuku was no longer there. He rolled off the table, landing on his hands and knees, gasping, entire body trembling. Blood fell from his mouth to the floor, smearing under his hands as he scrambled to his feet. The Nomu rounded the table, attempting to grab him, but Izuku somehow found the will to evade. He threw himself under the table, coming out the other side. The sutures at his joints had all split. With every step he took, he left a trail of red behind him. Too much. It was too much. It was a game of cat and mouse. He didn't know what the plan was evade until he had the strength to use his quirk again? It didn't seem like much of a plan, if he were being honest with himself. It didn't last long. The Nomu shoved the table out of the way and barreled toward Izuku. The teen fell to his knees as he tried to dodge one last time, legs giving out. The Nomu was on him a moment later, hand grabbing him from behind, claws piercing the fatigued muscles at the base of his neck. Izuku screamed, unable to do more than sway in its grip. The Nomu carried him like a limp kitten back to the table, practically throwing him onto its surface and holding him there. Except it didn't move to put the restraints back on. It only pressed him back against the table with a hand around his neck, not tight enough to choke him but feeling like an iron collar. Panting, Izuku realized the Nomu didn't have the capacity to remember to restrain him again. All it knew was to keep him there. Maybe if he gathered his strength again? No, even then, he knew he was done. His quirk was spent. He had no choice but to lay there, Nomu hovering over him. His vision was darkening around the edges, his pulse loud in his ears. As he lay there, he began hearing things. The clang of something hitting metal. Shouts nearby. A muffled boom. Fighting? His brows furrowed. Was someone fighting? His face relaxed as he dared to think, am I being rescued? He heard another set of explosions, two right after the other. His heart sped in his chest. He knew that explosion. He knew who was behind it. After all, he'd sparred against that quirk too many times to count to not recognize it. He was being rescued. He was being rescued. He didn't know who was out there with him, but he knew Kaken was out there. The Nomu's head perked up, hand loosening. Then it released him altogether and sped from the room, door remaining open a crack as it swung shut. Its sudden departure left Izuku blinking stupidly. What just happened? Whatever it was, he needed to take advantage of it. With the Nomu gone, he was the only obstacle in his own way. Spurred by the new hope, he sat up and attempted to step to the floor. Unfortunately, he ended up falling instead. He hit the floor on his side and remained lying there, groaning. He gasped, overwhelmed and unable to force his muscles to move again. That was it. That was all he had. It didn't matter how much he willed himself to get up, to go help. All he could do was lay there, vision blackening further. DMN. He tried keeping his eyes open, but he couldn't manage it. The last thing he saw before passing out was the cracked door, beckoning him closer. XXX. The BSTRD tried to run. Shota nearly threw his knife right into the man's neck as soon as he saw him scramble to his feet, but he stopped himself. If anything, he didn't want his students to witness that death. If he had it his way, he would rip the man into small pieces using his bare hands, relishing in the cries that would surely ensue. But he was still a teacher. He was still a hero. However, it didn't stop him from sprinting after the man, quickly catching up to him. The man had run around the corner, aiming for a room tucked away in the back of the warehouse. There was a worn metal door set into the wall, rusted and thick. But the doctor only managed to get his fingertips to brush the handle before Shota was on him. His capture weapon wrapped around the man's leg and he jerked him backward. No! Let me go, the doctor shouted, attempting to untangle himself from the weapon without success. Shota only stopped tugging him along the floor when he stood over the sniveling coward. The room therein is filled with boxes, some empty and some still containing unused medical equipment. Shota spots an entire case of oxygen bottles tucked against the wall. Where is Midoriya? I won't ask again. Shota glared down at the man, 1 second away from saying screw it and killing the man anyway. The doctor's eyes were wide and his face was screwed up in fear. He squirmed on the floor like a bug. As he took a big deep breath, Shota tilted his head, confused. Then the man screamed, calling out, Nomu, come to me. Thankfully, his students weren't helpless. They knew what was about to happen, what was coming their way. With their backs to each other, the 3 hero students prepared themselves for a fight. And a fight they were getting. A Nomu burst through the door, large frame packed with muscle. It resembled the Nomu that had nearly killed him at the USJ during their first year, though he could tell it wasn't nearly as powerful. The doctor pointed to Shota and commanded the Nomu to destroy them. It immediately jumped into action. Shota released his capture weapon and lifted his arms to block whatever attack was about to come, but an explosion rocked the Nomu back away from him before it could strike. Bakugo's hand smoked as he readied himself for another round. "Focus on him," Bakugo said steadily, eyes never leaving the Nomu. The lumbering creature was getting back to its feet. "We'll take this thing down." Ashido and Todoroki were already standing beside Bakugo. Todoroki nodded silently to Shota. The display made Shota smile. His students would be fine. How could he forget how capable they were? Bakugo launched forward, beating the Nomu back with small, controlled explosions while Todoroki held it still, ice climbing up to its chest. Ashido jumped in between the explosions, throwing acid into its face as quickly as she could, ducking out of the way before Bakugo caught her in the attack aimed at the creature. Which left Shota to deal with the doctor. The man had gotten to his feet and pulled a small knife from somewhere. He held it up to Shota, as if he could fend off the hero with such a weapon. Shota discarded his capture weapon for the moment. If the doctor wanted to fight, Shota was more than willing to entertain him. As Shota approached, the doctor slashed at the air aimlessly, clearly unused to wielding the weapon in such a manner. No, he was used to making fine cuts, slicing into flesh methodically. It made Shota sick to think about. The hero dodged his clumsy attempts with ease. He caught the man's wrist when the doctor attempted to cut him next. "My turn," Shota said, twisting the man's wrist hard enough to force him to drop the blade. The man cried out weakly, but Shota wasn't done. Not nearly. His first punch smashed into the doctor's face, throwing the man to the floor. Shota kicked him roughly in the ribs and then dropped, digging his knee into the man's stomach. He gagged, gasping through the blood that gushed from his nose and split lip. Again and again, Shota struck, not caring that his knuckles were beginning to bleed. He didn't notice the blood splattering across his face or how the doctor wasn't fighting back. Midoriya better be alive. "I swear, if you've killed him, I will give you a fate worse than death," Shota promised, leaning in close. The doctor's glasses had been thrown from his face, shattered against the floor. The man himself was limp against the floor, his face a bloody pulp. "Where is he?" the hero asked, grabbing the doctor by the chin and forcing him to look him in the eye. "Tell me now or I swear I will cut out your tongue." The doctor coughed up more blood. Shota squeezed, jaw creaking in his hand. "Where is he?" Finally, sensing his only other option was pain, the doctor gave in. He turned his head, eyes directing Shota. The hero followed his line of sight. It was the metal door across the room. It was open a crack, light shining from within. Shota stood, kicking the doctor hard in the side of the head and knocking him unconscious. His students had effectively subdued the Nomu, Bakugo finishing it off by blowing its partially acid-eaten head right off its shoulders. He didn't say anything, not bothering to tell them to follow him when they were already doing so. He slowly shoved the door open, holding his breath from fear of what he would find. XXX. There was a ringing in his ears that wouldn't stop. It was deafening, yet he could still hear his ragged breathing, echoing in his head. Everything hurt. Izuku didn't know if this was what death was like, but seemed cruel if that was the case. Shouldn't death be a relief, a reprieve from the torture? His eyes fluttered open and he groaned, low and long. Even in his ears, it sounded pathetic. He couldn't do more than blink, heavy lids unable to fully lift. Oh. He wasn't dead. He was still in the lab, still on the floor. There was blood spreading outward from underneath him, but he couldn't bring himself to be concerned. Everything was held at arm's length. But not the pain. No, that was just as strong as it had been before. Izuku remained lying on his side, temple resting on the cold concrete. He was facing the door, but he couldn't recall why. Why was he on the floor again? He knew he was injured, but he couldn't recall what led to his condition. Everything hurt. He was dizzy and so tired. His heartbeat seemed slow and weak in his chest. Thump, thump, thump. He began counting, losing count every so often and having to start over. From that position, he saw the door open slowly, a hand guiding it as it went. No. No, please no. No more. He couldn't take any more. He knew he couldn't endure one more second of the doctor's hands on him, touching and cutting in. He couldn't do it anymore. Izuku was too weak to get up, to fight. He could hardly lift his arms and cover his face, cowering on the floor underneath the table. His whimpers were loud in his ears. Tears fell from his eyes. This was it. He was about to be lifted back onto the table and torn apart. A hand touched his shoulder and he cried out, clumsily lashing out. His only hand clawed at the floor as he tried and failed to get away. "Don't touch me," he screamed, voice cracking. "Don't fing touch me." The hand didn't leave and even more came down on his raw skin. He screamed, curling up tighter. His sobs broke his own heart and he begged for death. No more. No more. No more. There were voices above him, but he couldn't understand them. He couldn't focus, couldn't control his ragged breathing or his now speeding heart. All he knew was fear. It flooded his veins and told him to run, to get out, to do anything he could to escape. There was a hand on his chest. He barely registered it. He didn't notice someone taking his hand and placing it on something warm. It took far too long for him to recognize it as someone's chest, their heart thumping against his palm and their chest rising and falling with each breath. That thundering heart wasn't his. He knew the doctor would never stoop down and comfort him like that. Who? He somehow forced his eyes back open, pulling his other arm away from his face. While his vision remained slightly blurred and dark around the edges, he saw a familiar scarred face surrounded by black hair. There were other bodies around him, but he couldn't manage to focus on them. "Zawa?" he asked quietly. The man's face split into a watery grin. He squeezed Izuku's hand and bowed his head briefly. "Yeah, Izuku, it's me. Your classmates are here too." Izuku's head dropped back and he found Todoroki crouched over him, wrapping bandages around his bleeding limbs. Ashido knelt beside Todoroki, holding a wad of gauze to a spot on his ribs. When she met his eyes, she smiled and let out a relieved sob. "Hey, Midoriya. We're here. We're getting you out." He didn't notice Bakugo staring at the crude sutures where his arms suddenly ended, hand long gone. His tears flowed steadily, but that time they were from pure elation and relief. He was getting rescued. He forced himself to stop, reining in his excitement. "You're real, right? Not hallucination?" "No, Zuku, you're not hallucinating," came a tight reply. It made Izuku turn his head a fraction and stare at Bakugo. The teen was on his knees, hands clenched against his thighs. His eyes remained unwavering. "We're here to rescue you." Izuku leaned his head back, sobbing through clenched teeth. He was safe. He was getting out. His entire body buzzed with joy. No longer was he lying heavily on the floor, he was floating, wonderfully weightless. "Stay with us, Midoriya," someone said, voice entering his ear and seeping into his brain. "Keep your eyes open." He did as he was told, though he couldn't lift his eyelids more than a fraction. He was so tired. All he wanted to do was sleep. Now that he was safe, he knew it would be okay. Everything would be okay. The voice that had spoken before was farther away the next time he heard it. His hand was now resting on the floor, no longer pressed against Aizawa's chest. Strange. He hadn't felt it move. "We need medics down here. As quickly as we can get them." "You're going to be okay," someone else said, close to his head. "We'll get you out of here soon." Someone touched his leg, right over the sutures, and he gasped, flinching away. "Sorry. I know it hurts, but we need to stop the bleeding." Yeah, that made sense. "Do what you have to do," he told them. Or, he tried. He couldn't force any words out. His eyes fell shut again, but no one made him open them. He was still awake enough to hear someone come closer, purposeful steps. "We can't move him just yet. I don't know what kind of injuries he has. You three stay here with him. I need to take the doctor to the other heroes. He won't be escaping. Go. We've got him." Hands began touching him again, moving him from his side and lifting his chest. He groaned with the movement, eyes fluttering open. Ashido smiled down at him, cradling him in her arms. It was nice, though he couldn't help but continue to grunt and groan at the constant agony stabbing into his brain. Ashido ran a hand through his hair, gently soothing him as much as she could. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Cryin'?" he asked, shakily lifting his hand to wipe away a fresh tear. She caught his hand, squeezing it softly. "Don't worry about me. I'm just happy we found you." He sighed, eyes closing again. "Me too." Those hands continued to wrap bandages around his mutilated body, Ashido's fingers carting through his hair, and he wanted nothing more than to be there for it. But it was taking all his strength to stay present. In the end, he let them take care of things. He couldn't stop his brain from shutting down, and for the first time since he was taken he knew when he woke up he would be safe. Shota hated hospitals. He hated having to visit his students there. He hated having to visit his friends there. He hated having to walk those all-too-bright hallways, stupid hotel art decorating the walls. He hated the smells and the sounds. It was overwhelming. It wasn't the hospital itself that drove him nuts, though it certainly didn't help. He hated the way his heart ached during each visit. That day, aiming for Midoriya's room, that familiar throbbing in his chest seemed worse than usual. It didn't that he had seen Midoriya in his hospital bed, wrapped up like a mummy and monitored by a team of nurses and doctors. All he could see was the way the kid had been in the warehouse, huddled on the floor in a puddle of his own blood. Those wounds, there were no words to describe what they had looked like, what they meant. To Shota, they represented his failure. Every wound was on him. Ms. Midoriya had kept him in the loop, even when she didn't have to. As soon as Shota had hopped up in the back of the ambulance with Midoriya, the medics becoming a tornado of activity around the unconscious kid, he had called Ms. Midoriya. The woman had met them at the hospital and had hardly left her son's side since, even after those long 3 days. Shota hadn't been allowed back with Midoriya when he was first brought in. Both he and the boy's mother had been forced to wait in a family room as the doctors worked on the teen. Later, after Midoriya was wheeled into a room in the hospital bed, the doctor told them what they'd been doing for hours upon hours. Apparently, all the sutures that had been stitched into Midoriya's body had to be removed and replaced. It had been a tedious process. Shota had done his best to ignore the nausea crawling up in his throat as the doctor pointed out the lines of sutures all over the kid's body. Apparently, the doctor had made seams along his entire body up and down each leg, each arm, his sides, his stomach, his chest, even his neck. Thankfully there were no indications the doctor messed with his head, but that seemed to be the only good news. On the second day of Midoriya's hospital stay, they had taken him back to the OR. There, the surgical team did what they could to save his arm. However, there had been too much damage to the bones of his lower arm and they'd amputated just below the elbow. From what Shota understood, there had been signs of infection in the bone marrow. It was a miracle they'd been able to salvage anything below the shoulder. During that long and painful process, Midoriya had been kept sedated. It wasn't because of the surgery, but it at least kept him from having to experience what Shota could only assume was agony. Shota hadn't been there for his seizure, but Ms. Midoriya had. Later, when he'd come back to the hospital to see how the kid was doing, she'd pulled him aside and told him what she knew. Midoriya was in withdrawal and had a seizure because of it. The doctor had told her that extended use of some quirk suppressants could cause withdrawal seizures and they ventured to guess he'd been on suppressants during his captivity. Midoriya was sedated and monitored for additional seizures, but the doctors seemed hopeful about his recovery. At some point, a feeding tube had been put in and the kid was being fed plenty of calories to get his strength back. Midoriya needed to be able to fight off any infections that set in and Shota wanted to see him back on his feet as soon as possible. The kid had been near starving by the time he'd been found. It was clear the doctor hadn't fed him the entire time he'd been there. Shota had seen the kid since arriving at the hospital, and while he looked better than he had in the warehouse he still appeared as a shadow of himself. Now, standing in front of Midoriya's hospital room, he paused, breathing through the dread he felt, and then attempting to shake off the guilt for it. He shouldn't dread seeing his student. He shouldn't hesitate to step inside that room. Yet, in the warehouse, Shota had rushed to his student without a single moment of hesitation. He'd hardly dared to breathe as he took in the damage, overwhelmed by it. So much blood, smeared across the kid's body. Lines of sutures, so many split open and exposing the tissue beneath. Midoriya had panicked, covering his face with. Shota had frozen for a fraction of a second as he saw what had been taken from his student. His hand. His hand. But he'd pushed past his own panic and done his best to get the kid to calm down, to realize help had arrived. And when Midoriya finally relaxed, arm uncovering his bloody face, Shota had nearly melted to the floor with an endless stream of apologies. When he'd stepped out, stooping to grab the doctor where he hadn't moved from the floor, Shota had broken down. He hadn't stopped moving, hadn't dared to drop to his knees like he wanted. As he dragged the doctor toward the other heroes, he'd sobbed through his teeth, shaking with rage. The man underneath his hand had done that to a child. To Shota's kid. Shota took a deep breath now and opened the door, softly knocking as he stepped inside. Ms. Midoriya was sitting in her usual spot beside her son's bed, doing what she could to get into a comfortable position. The woman was amazingly strong, having endured everything without a single complaint. "I can sit with him for a bit if you want to get something to eat, maybe even go home and get some rest," he said quietly. Ms. Midoriya's gaze swept over her son, considering. They took him off some of his medications. He's still on something for pain, but they're waiting to see if he needs the She put a hand to her temple. "Oh, I forgot what they called the medication. For his seizures. They think he might be in the clear, at least on that front." She gave Shota a shallow smile. It faded quickly. Shota nodded. Good. Maybe Midoriya would wake up soon. Every time he'd visited, the kid had remained still in the bed, like a doll that had been played with a little too roughly. He took the seat on the other side of Midoriya. He couldn't bear to look at his face yet, so he stared at the monitor beside him, counting his heartbeats and watching the waving lines. "You know," Ms. Midoriya started, drawing Shota's attention. She had her elbows leaned on the bed, right where Midoriya's arm would be if it was still there. "My little Izuku was premature. Nothing too crazy, only a few weeks, but he had to spend some time in the hospital. It was torture for both of us, I think. As a new mother, I don't think a single night went by that I didn't have a mental breakdown in his hospital room." She chuckled, eyes far away. It was a few minutes before she looked back up at Shota, clearly lost in thought. Did you know I asked him to quit? To walk away from UA and quit being a hero. Shota sked on a breath, surprised. No, ma'am, I didn't. She nodded, wringing her hands. I did. I'm not proud of it. I realize now it was selfish of me to ask that of him. To walk away from what he loves. To stop being who he is. He's always been a hero, even without the license. Izuku has always helped people and given every part of himself to others. Even when it hurt him. I guess I saw that and was worried one day he would give just a little too much. Her eyes glistened and she took in a stuttering breath. Somehow, she held in her tears as she said, I was only thinking of myself, how him getting hurt would affect me. But my little Izuku told me he couldn't quit. He asked me to be strong for him so he could be strong for others. A tear finally escaped the woman and she didn't bother to wipe it away. That was the first time he had ever looked so determined. Of course, he's been determined about things before. He's passionate. I'm sure you've noticed. Shota couldn't help but laugh. Yeah, I've noticed. Ms. Midoriya laughed with him, leaning forward to pat Izuku on the leg, careful to stay away from any wounds. When he told me he wouldn't quit, I knew something like this might happen. I didn't know when and I didn't know what it would look like, but I knew the hero life would hurt him. She swallowed hard, steepling her hands on the bed as if praying over her son. But he's no longer the little baby I sat beside in the hospital, wondering how something so small could possibly survive. He's a hero now, even if I hate it. And he's asked me to respect his choice. I love my son and I don't want anything to happen to him. I love him enough to watch him go into a job I know might kill him. And if that day ever comes, it will kill me too. I can't lose him, but I also know it would be even worse to stop him, to watch that light in his eyes fade. Sometimes love hurt more than anything in life. Shota knew that well enough. Ms. Midoriya stood suddenly, purse slung over her shoulder. I think I'll take you up on your offer if you're okay staying with him. She bent over her son and kissed his forehead, whispering something in his ear that Shota couldn't hear. The moment was achingly sweet. She ran her hand over his curls and smiled down on him. I'll be back in a few hours, Izuku. Her departure plunged the room into silence. Of course, there were the typical hospital room sounds beeping and the occasional alarm, distant sounds of the hospital beyond that room. He leaned forward as Ms. Midoriya had done, resting his elbows on the bed. Finally, he forced himself to take stock of his student. Recovery Girl hadn't come yet, and as far as he knew there hadn't been another healing quirk used on the kid. It showed. Somehow had washed his hair, likely Ms. Midoriya, and his short curls were fluffy and clean. It was the only part of him that didn't seem affected by his week with the doctor. The kid's face had taken a beating, likely right before they'd arrived, if he went by the freshness of the wounds. His nose had been broken, bruising spreading across his nose and under his eyes. There were a few bandaged wounds on his face, the most severe being the massive open cut on his chin. When he'd been brought to the hospital, bone had been visible once the blood had been cleared away. A hospital gown had been placed on Midoriya and most of his wounds were covered by bandages. Though, the arm Shota rested beside was exposed. The man ignored the angry lines down the kid's skin, locking in on his hand. There were bruises and broken nails, but everything considered it was the best they could hope for. At least he had a hand left. Because the doctor had taken his other hand. He'd been trying not to think about it, but there it was. Midoriya used his hands for his quirk. Shota knew the kid would still function without that arm. The world of prosthetics was leaps and bounds ahead, especially after the war with so many heroes requiring assistance, but it would be difficult. Shota knew that intimately, having faced that reality. Even as briefly as it had been. Maybe Eri could help Midoriya. It was a long shot. They'd been practicing with her quirk, but it wasn't consistent. As expected, such a powerful quirk was difficult to control. To rewind injuries and not kill the person took amazing control. After fixing Shota, Eri had fallen unconscious for days, the toll on her brain hitting her in full force. Shota didn't know if she had the control to fix Midoriya just yet. He didn't know if they wanted to risk it. In the end, it would be up to Midoriya. It was his life. Shota's phone began buzzing with unread texts. He sighed, leaning back to answer. He hadn't answered any of the phone calls or texts over the last few days, allowing his time at the station and at the hospital to distract him. But now, sitting beside his student, knowing he was finally safe, Shota knew it was time. XXX. Everything felt blurry. No, that wasn't it. Things felt fuzzy, soft, and distant. It was nice. Sort of. It made opening his eyes nearly impossible. Izuku's eyes blinked open a sliver. Whatever the doctor had given him, it was better than anything before. Had he finally given Izuku something for the pain? He hadn't done that before. That thought made him force his eyes open more, begging his brain to figure out what was going on. If the doctor had changed things, it couldn't be good. What else did the doctor do? He thought. However, his brows came together as he stared at a ceiling, not rafters. And the light was different, not a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. His sluggish brain tried and failed to understand. That was when he noticed he was no longer on the table, laying on something soft and squishy. No restraints. Slowly, he turned his head, allowing his cheek to flop against the pillow. A pillow. He was reeling from that new development alone. When he saw who sat beside him, he nearly began weeping. Mr. Aizawa sat slumped in a chair beside him, phone held up to his face and eyes narrowed in frustration as he typed quickly. The man didn't notice Izuku yet, which was fine with him because he was about to lose it. Was he really out? Had he been rescued? There was a distant recollection of seeing his classmates and his teacher while in the lab, lying on the floor. But it was hazy and felt more like a hallucination or a dream. But, had it been real? At that moment, Mr. Aizawa jerked upright in the chair, dropping his phone. Midoriya, Mr. Aizawa breathed, eyes wide and searching. Hey, Mr. Aizawa, DMN, his voice sounded terrible. When was the last time he'd spoken? How long had he been asleep? All valid questions, but there was only one he wanted answered. Is this real? Mr. Aizawa smiled, genuine and happier than Izuku had ever seen him. The man grabbed Izuku's hand and squeezed it softly. Yeah, it is. This is real. We got you out. I'm sorry it took us so long. Izuku wanted to wipe that look off the man's face, guilt and regret. But he didn't have the words or the strength for it. Later. Can you help me sit up? He asked instead. He didn't want to lay flat anymore. Maybe never again. It reminded him too much of the lab. He felt too vulnerable in that position. Mr. Aizawa jumped up, grabbing the remote to the bed and tilting it up until Izuku was able to see the room. The room and the rest of his body. He took in the wounds, both the ones he could see and the ones he felt, though distantly. But when his eyes landed on the empty space below his arm, he froze. He'd sworn he felt both hands, forgetting for a moment what the doctor had done. But it looked like more had been taken, his arm now ending just below the elbow. Tears sprung to his eyes and flooded his vision, a single sob breaking through. Silent tears streaked down his face and he closed his eyes. All he could do was focus on his breathing, reminding himself that he'd gotten out, that he was free. The doctor wasn't going to walk in at any moment and drag him through hell. How bad, he gasped. When Mr. Aizawa didn't answer, Izuku opened his eyes and looked over at the man. He was still holding Izuku's hand. His jaw was clenched tightly and he couldn't seem to meet the teen's gaze. Are you sure you want to know right now? You just woke up. You have time to. I need to know. Please. It seemed his plea was the last push the man needed. I'm sure you're aware of most of your injuries. The biggest issue was your arm. There was an infection in the bone marrow and the doctors here had to remove some of it. You still have your elbow joint and I've been told this is the best case scenario. Best case scenario. It was almost laughable. Since you're awake now, they'll probably take out the feeding tube. You needed calories and fast, Mr. Aizawa added, pointing to the feeding tube taped to his cheek. Izuku untangled his hand from his teacher's, brushing against the foreign thing. He'd hardly felt it, too focused on everything else. Because he had you on suppressants for so long, when you were off them you went into withdrawal and had a seizure. They had you on medication for the last 3 days, but we're watching for any more. Izuku nodded along with his words. After the loss of his hand and some of his arm, everything else seemed unimportant. How long was I there? Mr. Aizawa's face pinched in pain. The man looked like a dog ready to be hit. A week. We didn't find you for a week. That time, it was Izuku comforting him. He grabbed Mr. Aizawa's hand and squeezed tightly. Izuku made sure the man was meeting his eye as he said, Don't do that. Don't put that on yourself. You made it in the end. You got me out. That's what you get to take credit for. You don't get to claim the time I spent there. That's on him, not you. Please, don't bear that burden. He didn't think he could take it if Mr. Aizawa, the teacher he loved and respected and saw as a sort of father figure, found guilt each time he looked at Izuku. It was too much. The pain was beginning to show through his clouded mind. While his thoughts were coming in sharper, so were his wounds making themselves known. He knew in a few minutes he would feel every inch of wounded skin. His arm hurt. What was left of it? The tears came again, eyes burning. He stared at the ceiling, thankful it wasn't bare rafters. He couldn't stand to see another rafter. How am I going to be a hero like this? He asked, gasping out the question. How was he going to save others when he couldn't even tie his shoes? He couldn't use his quirk with that hand any longer. All those hours of practicing his combat abilities, the scars he'd collected on that hand, gone. It didn't matter that he knew he was spiraling, he couldn't control his thoughts. His heart was fluttering in his chest and his breathing was shallow. That was it. He was going to die there in that hospital bed. Because he was facing a future where he would watch his classmates, his friends, go on without him. He was losing more than just a hand, he was losing himself. He was born to be a hero. He'd known that since he first watched All Might on TV. If he couldn't do that, who was he? Izuku. I need you to breathe with me. He jerked his head to look toward where the voice had come from. He couldn't focus on who that was, vision pulsing with each heartbeat. That's it. Focus on my breathing, okay? Match my breaths. Feel my heartbeat. He didn't know when it had happened, but his hand was pressed against the man's chest, rising and falling steadily. He felt the soft thumping beneath his fingertips, quick and strong. He tried to slow his breathing, but it was like stopping a moving train. Do you remember when you and Kirishima were training, about 3 months ago? Mr. Aizawa asked, strangely. You two didn't hear me tell you to stop and collided. You and Bakugo are the only 2 people who can knock the wind out of him. You both collapsed to the ground and I nearly had a heart attack. A small chuckle. At the time, I'm sure you both felt like you were dying. Somehow, as the man spoke, Izuku began to calm down. He did remember that day. Bakugo had accidentally broken Izuku's leg the week before and he'd been forced to sit out of training until Recovery Girl gave him a clean bill of health. It seemed that pent-up energy had to go somewhere. You're doing good. Take a deep breath, in for 4 and out for 4. Mr. Aizawa tapped Izuku's hand as he counted. It took several long minutes, but eventually Izuku was able to lay back against the bed and was able to focus on the present once more. Mr. Aizawa released Izuku's hand and leaned his elbows on the bed. It was very casual, strangely so. But Izuku didn't mind. For what it's worth, I know you can still be a hero. It will be challenging and you'll have to work so hard. But you can do it. He was stunned. Mr. Aizawa believed in him? His dreams, his passion, his very purpose wasn't too far out of reach? He didn't want to hope for a future that wouldn't come to pass, but he knew his teacher didn't give false assurances. Maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't lose everything. XXX. The kid ended up falling asleep shortly after their conversation, tears still drying on his cheeks. Shota couldn't help but run his hand over the kid's head, brushing back his hair. Midoriya had told him not to feel guilty about things, but how could he not? Shota should have been able to find him in a day, not after 7. He should have been able to save the kid from all his pain. He sat with the teen until Ms. Midoriya got back. A nurse had come in during Shota's visit, giving Midoriya another dose of pain meds. The kid hadn't woken up to tell them if it did the job, but Shota supposed that was a good thing. Shota had intended to get up and leave in a little while now that Ms. Midoriya was back, but Hisashi came and pulled him out a few minutes early. The other hero smiled politely at Ms. Midoriya, excusing the 2 of them. Sorry, I need to steal eraser from you. She waved them away. Don't mind me. Thank you both for everything you've done. Shota closed the door behind them. Hisashi didn't say anything as they walked down the hall, and Shota tried to ask where they were going. The man shook his head and told him, not now. When we're outside. It was only when Hisashi dragged him into his car parked outside that he finally snapped, what is happening? What are you doing here? Hisashi's hands were tight on the steering wheel. Tsukachi has information for you. About Midoriya's case. Shota's brows furrowed. What information? What did they? You'll have to ask Tsukachi. What he did to him. Hisashi shook his head, frazzled. Shota was frozen in his seat. Hisashi didn't get frazzled easily. Clearly something had rocked him to his core. Shota had a feeling he wasn't going to like any of it. I didn't get many details, but I was there when the doctor talked about it. Shota didn't push any further. The long minutes to the station dragged on, dread building in the pit of his stomach. He didn't want to know. Knowing would be too much. But Hisashi pulled up along the curb and unlocked the door. Shota got out, pausing as he noticed Hisashi wasn't getting out. You coming? He asked. Hisashi met his eye, stunning the other man. That was fear and sorrow he was seeing. I've already heard it. I don't need to know any more. You're stronger than I am. You'll be fine. Inside, Tsukachi immediately spotted him and pulled the hero into his office, shutting the door and blinds. Not a good sign. Shota almost walked out, unwilling to face it. Before you tell me, I need to know how bad this is. There was tired devastation on the detective's face. It made Shota's shoulders sag. That bad, huh? It's not good, Eraser. I don't have to give you the details if you don't want them. Shota took a deep breath, closing his eyes briefly. He took a seat across from Tsukachi's desk and nodded. All right, tell me. Tsukuchi sunk down in his own chair, folding his hands and clicking his teeth in thought. Shota almost wished he'd told the man he didn't want to hear it. Since they'd captured the doctor, he had remained tight-lipped. He hadn't asked for a lawyer, hadn't asked for water or food. Nothing. He hadn't given any details whatsoever. Until that day, apparently. He just started talking. I don't know what got him speaking, but once he started he never stopped. With each detail, the nausea in his stomach worsened. The doctor kept Midoriya awake. Through all of it. Kept him paralyzed and breathing, but awake. He cut off Midoriya's hand and sewed on a Nomu's, then he cut it off because it didn't work. Those sutures had been placed after he cut into the kid just to see what was inside. Shota didn't give the detective warning as he lunged from his chair toward the trash, emptying the contents of his stomach inside. Unfortunately, I have more. I don't know if you want to know. Screw that sheet. Tell me, Shota ground out, returning to his seat. Even if it ruined him, he needed to know. Midoriya had endured it. Shota should be able to hear about it without breaking. Tsukachi regarded him sadly. He seemed to be considering something, but Shota couldn't begin to guess what it was. Finally, the man sighed and grabbed a file off his desk. We found the doctor's research. He wrote everything down. The man offered Shota the file. Unsurprisingly, the doctor's handwriting was atrocious. It was the scribblings of a madman. But he was still able to read some of what he'd written. None of it was good. He didn't get far into the file before he closed it, unable to hear that man's thoughts. What else? Shota asked, because he sensed there was more, one final nail in the coffin. Tsukachi wordlessly turned his computer and hit play. It was immediately clear what he was watching. A camera was moved into place, capturing the view from the feet of whoever was laid out on the metal surgical table. As it was moved, he caught sight of Midoriya's face, tilted back with a tube shoved down his throat. The camera stopped moving, capturing the doctor hovering over Midoriya's leg. Shota clenched his teeth hard enough to break his molars as the man began cutting, speaking to the camera as if he were excitedly explaining a new toy. Oh, you see, right here the muscle tone is astounding for someone of his age. Oh, and here we have a bundle of nerves that seem to be, the man mumbled a bit, or maybe the ringing in Shota's ears was keeping him from hearing. He watched that BSTRD dissect his student like a dead frog, excitedly pointing to the various things he was seeing. At one point, the doctor frowned, looking to his side at something off camera. The man sked and said, "You're being difficult." There was a long moment of silence as the man watched something before cursing Midoriya's very existence. "Your heart is going too fast. I hope you're happy." Shota wanted to reach through the screen and strangle the doctor. The man moved out of view of the camera for a few minutes before returning. "Now, where were we?" "Enough," Shota said, looking away. "I've seen enough." Tsukachi turned the computer around, taking the doctor with his hands covered in Midoriya's blood out of his view. "Sorry, I know it's not a pretty sight. This is my third time seeing it and it still turns my stomach." That was an understatement. Shota shook his head, staring down at his hands. If anyone might understand what was going on in his head, in his heart, it was Tsukachi. While not the primary detective on the case, he'd been there the entire time. He had helped find Midoriya. How am I not supposed to feel guilty about this? It's my fault he's lying in a hospital bed right now. I should have been able to find him first thing, not after a DMN week. He's missing a hand. He has wounds that will create new scars all over his body, scars that will remind him of this for the rest of his life. How do I ignore that? How do I look him in the eye after all this as his teacher, as someone who was supposed to help him? Shota looked up at Tsukachi, desperate for an answer. He didn't know how to move on. Midoriya wouldn't ever be able to forget the things that had been done to him. He'd see them in his dreams, see the damage in the mirror. Tsukachi stood and came around his desk. He sat on the edge of his desk, shoulders sagging. "Truthfully? I have no idea. I'm trying to figure that out myself." He ran a hand through his hair, sliding down his face. "All I can come up with is this: we weren't the ones to hurt him. We did everything we could, even if it wasn't enough." That wasn't what he wanted. He wanted to hear a solution, something he could do to make his heart ache less. But he was familiar enough with failure in his job to know sometimes he had to simply endure it until the pain eased. He didn't think those pains would be leaving him anytime soon. After seeing the video and reading the doctor's notes, hearing about what he did to Midoriya, the kid's wounds looked different. Each line of sutures reminded him of what he'd seen. He wondered if there was ever a way to make it up to the kid. He didn't think so. XXX. Izuku knew he'd woken up a few times since coming to the hospital since he'd been rescued, a fact that still sent shivers of relief up and down his spine, but he was still groggy enough to hardly remember what had been said to him. He knew at one point Mr. Aizawa had been in the room. He remembered speaking to the man. Or rather, what was said to him. His teacher had given him more honest details than anyone else. Izuku's mom didn't want to upset him, which he understood, and his doctor seemed to speak over him instead of to him. Waking up now, he realized he was alone. The first time he'd been alone and aware of it since arriving at the hospital. He wanted to be alone right now, strangely enough. He needed a minute to self-assess without pitying glances or clinical explanations. He was sitting up in bed and had been since Mr. Aizawa first moved him into that position. He remembered slurring to his mom to stop when she started moving the bed back down so he could sleep, almost pleading with her to stop. He couldn't lay flat anymore, not yet. It was sitting up that he was able to see some of the damage done, though most of it was covered by bandages. Someone had put socks on his feet, but he could still feel the stiffness, the pain where the doctor had cut him open. He could feel those same wounds up his legs, his stomach, his side, his chest. Everywhere. He hadn't known the extent of the damage while in the doctor's care, far too overwhelmed by everything else to realize. He swallowed, forcing his eyes to the empty space on the bed. He could still feel the rest of his arm, his fingers. If he closed his eyes and concentrated, he could feel his fingers wiggling, moving against the bed. It was while he forced himself to recognize that loss that Mr. Yamada knocked and opened the door, stepping inside with a cheery grin on his face. He leaned dramatically against the door frame, shooting finger guns at Izuku. "How you doing, kiddo?" the man asked. "Honestly? Terrible." The pain was worse than when he'd first woken up. He guessed they were weaning him off his medications. His mental state was shit and he was scared each time the door opened. But instead of telling him that, Izuku gave him a soft smile and said, "I'm doing better, thank you." Mr. Yamada waved him away, coming into the room. He plopped down on the chair Mr. Aizawa had occupied earlier and kicked his feet up. Izuku appreciated that there wasn't any pity in the man's eyes, though there seemed to be something darker, weighing him down. Izuku didn't ask, sure there was the same look in his own eyes. "I know you've only been awake for a little while and you're still recovering, but your classmates are climbing the walls to get in here. I figured I'd ask you first before I let them flood your room. You want visitors or should I send them packing?" he asked. Izuku's cheeks reddened. "They're here," he squeaked out, looking past Mr. Yamada as if he'd suddenly see his classmates crowded around his room. His teacher laughed. "Some of them are in the waiting room. Though, the others still on campus are likely headed this way. But it's up to you. If you don't want company, I'll send them away." What Izuku really wanted to do was have Mr. Yamada tell them to go home. He wanted to see his classmates, really, but not right then. Not when he was still reeling from everything himself. He didn't have the mental strength to have them break down in front of him. He was still breaking down himself. But he couldn't bring himself to do that, to have his teacher send his friends back to the dorms where he knew they'd continue to worry about him. He rationalized that while he had been the victim of the doctor, endured, he didn't want to think about what he'd endured. Not all of it. While he'd been a victim, he knew his friends had also suffered. If he were in their position, he would want to see his classmate in the hospital. He would want to know they were okay. "Sure. They can come." He hesitated, bunching up the blanket in his fist. Mr. Yamada waited patiently. "I don't think I can handle them all at once." Do you think it's okay if only a few came at once?" They can all come eventually, just rotate? Come in groups?" Mr. Yamada winked, standing and gently touching Izuku's foot on his way to the door. "That sounds great, listener. I love your class, but you guys are a lot to handle all at once. I think small groups is a wonderful idea. Do you want them to start coming now or wait a while?" Ideally, they would wait until a few days from then, but he put himself in their position once more. "Now is fine," he answered. Which led to a few of his friends coming in for a visit. Thankfully, the first to visit were Uraraka, Ida, and Todoroki. Todoroki had seen Izuku before in the lab, and it strangely made the wounded teen feel better. The others hadn't seen the damage yet, but he had. He knew what to expect. Maybe he should have asked Mr. Yamada to tell them what he looked like, what condition he was in, before having them come. Though, that would probably have the opposite effect. "Midoriya, it's so good to see you," Ida said, coming forward instantly and bowing. Uraraka rushed forward and threw herself in the chair to his left, holding a gift bag to her chest. "Are you in any pain? We heard you were really hurt. We wanted to visit a few days ago, but they told us you weren't stable yet." Her wide eyes were pinned on his face and he smiled shyly. "I'm not in any pain," he said, lying through his teeth. He wanted the pain to go away, for it to leave him alone forever, but he had to endure it if he wanted to stay awake. Right now, he wanted to stay awake. When he was given things through his fore, he had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from screaming or ripping the fore out. He knew it was a nurse, not the doctor, but all he could see was that man. All he felt when things got a little blurry and the medications took him back to sleep was that metal table. Uraraka moved the bag she held out to him and he took it. However, that was when she noticed his arm. Her hands flew to her mouth and she gasped, staring. Staring and staring and staring. No one said anything as she burst into tears, apologizing to him for the display. He hated it. He wanted to scream for them to leave, to tell Mr. Yamada that no one else could come. He knew all they would see was his arm. All they would see was what the doctor did to him. You think I don't know what he did? You think I don't feel it in my dreams? You think I don't want to scream and cry and curse the universe? No one asked about his arm. He didn't give them any details. Later, maybe. Always later. The rest of their visit was uneventful. They tried their best to cheer him up, talking just like they had before he was taken. But it felt empty, a clear distraction. For him. For them. So they didn't have to acknowledge the hard things. It didn't work. When they finally got up and left, it was Todoroki who hesitated, turning back around. The other two paused in the hallway, waiting for him. We got him. I don't know if anyone told you. He's in Tartarus. Izuku was stunned. No one had told him and he really hadn't thought about it. Thank you for telling me, he murmured, unsure what to do with that information. Todoroki nodded. Before leaving he said, and we killed the Nomu. All of them. And then he left, leaving Izuku in a state of relief and conflict. He didn't know how he felt about that, about all of it. The rest of his classmates came in and visited him throughout the day. It was a long and exhausting day, though he just laid in the bed. It was the act of forcing a smile onto his face, of having to watch his classmates see the damage. Again and again and again. They were the same, the looks in their eyes. He didn't fault them for it, but he was quickly coming to the end of his patience. The next person to look at him like that was going to get their eyes clawed out. Almost as if the universe heard him, the last group to visit that day was full of people who didn't have it in them to be gentle or have tact. Manners were not their strongest points. Bakugo walked in first, leading Ashido, Shiro, Kirishima, Kaminari, and Momo. A strange group, yes, but the opposite of everyone else who had come through. There weren't any less exhausting, but they were better. The small hospital room was suddenly packed with the bodies that occupied it. Bakugo claimed the seat to his left, and Izuku waited for him to acknowledge the same thing everyone else almost immediately spotted. How could they not? Yet he never did. His eyes passed over the bandaged stump of his arm and moved on, not a single flicker in his gaze. Listening to me? Bakugo snapped, glaring at Izuku. You're not. Will you stop spacing out? I'm gracing you with my presence and you're daydreaming? The nerve. Izuku huffed a breath. He was about to apologize, but Ashido jumped into the conversation. Literally. She reached out, grabbing Izuku's face, and wiggled her way onto the bed as much as she could. In a few seconds, she was spooning him, arms guarding him as if Bakugo would reach out and punch him. Izuku could do nothing but allow her to do what she wanted, too shocked and tired to really fight back. As long as she didn't touch his injuries, she could do whatever the hell she wanted to do. His classmates had already taken what little spare energy he had left. Don't you dare yell at my precious baby boy, she hissed at Bakugo. He doesn't need your particular brand of love right now. That made Bakugo screw up his face in confusion. Love? Love? You must have taken a blow to the head during that fight because I don't love anyone, let alone that nerd. I'm only here because you assholes dragged me along. As Ashido snapped back at him, Izuku did something that startled everyone in the room. He began laughing. It wasn't loud and it wasn't nearly the laugh all of them were accustomed to hearing throughout the dorm building, but it was something. Ashido eventually slid off the bed, courtesy of Momo reminding her that she might accidentally hurt Izuku if she continued to fight with Bakugo in that position. Ashido only pouted for a minute, bouncing back as soon as Momo began doting on Izuku. The two of them fluffed his pillow and adjusted his blanket, Momo tooting that the hospital blanket wasn't nearly enough. She remembered that Izuku liked fluffy blankets, that he got cold easily. It warmed his heart almost as much as the blanket she created. One thing that always cheered him up was hero merch. In one moment, Momo did more for him than anyone else had been able to do combined. Well, other than rescuing him. She created a blanket that featured everyone from their class. Small, cartoon versions of themselves. Izuku found himself grinning. It was perfect. Exhaustion was getting to him. Less than an hour into their visit, he was having a difficult time keeping his eyes open. They picked up on it, thankfully, and moved to leave. Kirishima fist-pumped him and flexed, placing a hand on his bicep in an all-too-familiar pose. Don't worry about a thing, Midoriya. We're here if you need us. We'll be strong for you until you can stand with us again. Izuku understood what he was trying to do, trying to say, but it only made things worse. He knew Kirishima didn't mean it, but it made Izuku feel weak, like he couldn't do anything. It wasn't far off from the truth. He managed to keep his smile up until the end. Bakugo was the last one out, kicking Ashido in the butt when she lingered too long. He looked over his shoulder at the forced smile Izuku wore and scowled. You better heal fast. All the extras aren't much of a challenge. As soon as the door shut behind them, his smile fell. It wasn't that he was unhappy. He was tired. Just tired. XXX. The doctor was smiling at Izuku from the foot of his bed. Smiling, trying to soften the blow as he discussed everything wrong with him. Izuku didn't listen closely, letting his mom take the brunt of it. He would be discharged in 2 days. That he did hear loud and clear. He'd been in the hospital for 5 days now and was going stir-crazy. He was ready to leave. Though, his body said otherwise. Recovery Girl had come to visit him the night before, healing what she could now that his energy had risen to an acceptable level. Of course, her quirk had knocked him down immediately and he'd woken up nearly 12 hours later with slightly less pain. It would take several more sessions with her before he was back to his new 100%. The doctor told him there were a few specialist consults coming his way, including an orthopedic doctor who worked with prosthetics for heroes. Along with that specialist, someone from UA was going to be coming by, or so he'd been told. They would start making his prosthetic, though he wouldn't be able to wear it until the site was completely healed. It was overwhelming. He wanted to get back to his normal. He wanted to go back to a time before the doctor. Recovery Girl will be back tomorrow morning to heal you again. You should feel very lucky to have someone with a quirk like that available to you, the man was saying, and Izuku nodded absently. Eventually, after the doctor left and his mom tried and failed to coax a conversation out of him, she got up and told him she was going to get a coffee. You want anything, sweetheart? She asked, waiting by the door. He shook his head, attempting a smile for her. She had been there nearly every waking moment, doing what she could to make the process easier. He wished he could offer her more than that weak attempt. No, thank you, Mom. I'm okay. She hesitated, but when he didn't say anything else she left. In her absence, Izuku slowly got out of bed, grabbing onto the 4-pole for support. Since Recovery Girl healed him, he was stiff and every inch of him felt like one massive bruise. But he could tell it was better than before. She'd told him to move around as much as he could, that being active would play a massive part in his recovery. He didn't know if that was true, but it felt good to be out of bed. 2 days. 2 more days, then he'd be out of there. Away from the smells and sounds that reminded him of that terrible place. He shuffled to the bathroom. He'd gotten up earlier, but his mom had been with him at the time and he hadn't wanted to have her there with him to witness that moment. He needed to do it alone, to face it without the added pressure. He moved to the mirror, keeping his eyes down until he stood square in front of it. Only then did he lift his gaze and stare at the person across from him. The mirror wasn't large enough to reflect his entire body, but it showed enough. The bandages on his face had been removed. Those cuts had been healed and were now light scars, one across his nose and the other jutting up from his chin. The bruising and swelling had gone down and his face resembled what had been there before. But he looked different. He didn't know what it was. Maybe his eyes. There were shadows beneath them, though he'd gotten plenty of sleep over the last few days. The eyes themselves seemed darker. Worn. After the war, he'd seen that look on the faces of heroes, even some of his classmates. He didn't think he'd ever wear it, though. The hospital gown hung off his frame, slipping low enough on his chest for him to see the sutures. The doctor had made a massive Y incision on his chest, as if he'd been a dead body and the doctor a medical examiner. Izuku didn't want to know what had been done to him after that incision was made, but he had his theories. None of them were pleasant, so he tried not to think about it. He failed. Those scars would never fade. After the sutures were removed and all that was left was puckered pink skin, he would bear the reminder of exactly what had been done. No one would ever mistake those scars for anything but what they were. He'd been cut open like a fish, made into someone's toy, and that was what he had to show for it. It was too much. He didn't know how to stop the ache in his chest. It hurt like nothing he'd ever known before. It wasn't like the cuts across his body or the burning of his missing hand. It made him feel hollow, like the doctor had removed a vital organ and left him bleeding out. He slid down the wall, hugging his knees. He didn't care that some of the sutures popped, splitting his skin wide open. He didn't care that blood smeared across his skin, his hand. He just didn't care. All he knew was sorrow, sobs threatening to crack his ribcage wide open. Hot tears slid down his cheeks and he did nothing to stop them. At some point, his mom came back, nearly dropping her coffee as she rushed into the bathroom to find him curled up tight. She didn't lose her cool, didn't cry and scream for help. She was an imperfect woman, but in that moment she knew what he needed. He needed a rock to hold on to. He felt her arms come around him, enveloping him in one of the only safe spaces he knew of at the moment. She pulled his head to her chest and allowed the low rumble of her voice to soothe the aches she could hardly imagine. It's going to be okay, she told him softly, stroking his hair. She didn't care about the blood that stained her clothes or the tears soaking into her shirt. It'll be okay. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but this is just the first hurdle. It gets better from here. He didn't know if that was true, but in her arms, he wanted to believe her. I'm not okay, Mom, he whispered. One hand stroked up and down his back and she shushed him softly. Soon, she was rocking him on the bathroom floor as if he were a newborn. I know. But okay isn't far. We'll get there. XXX. Things didn't get better that day. It might have been doomed from the start. A bad day, that was all it was. One bad day. Izuku almost asked to be left alone for the rest of the day, but he stopped himself from making such a request. He couldn't push everyone away because he was feeling down. He had to push forward. He had to keep moving. The orthopedic specialist came and went quickly, taking measurements and going over the scan of Izuku's arm. The man seemed hopeful, but Izuku didn't find his energy to be contagious. Yes, he had given himself a full-scale pity party. Later, Mr. Aizawa came with Mei. The girl was the top of her class at UA and was projected to be at the top of the market within a year of graduating. Normally, Izuku loved the time he spent in her presence. She'd grown on him and he actually enjoyed going to the support lab when he could to test out new prototypes or request a change to his costume. But that day, he nearly burst into tears upon seeing her, and not tears of joy. But he put on a smile. He wanted to be the old Izuku, the one who didn't worry people because of things like how broken he was. He liked it better when he worried his teacher because he broke too many bones. Mr. Aizawa sat in the corner and let Mei do her thing. She didn't ask before grabbing what was left of his arm, actually taking care not to hurt him any further. She pulled out a notepad and showed him a few sketches, and he did his best to remain present for that conversation. Any other day, he would have been happy to talk shop with her, praising her sketches and ingenuity. But not then. Not that day. Mr. Aizawa noticed almost immediately. Izuku could feel the man's eyes on him the entire time. So he played along, doing what he could to be the kid he'd been before 2 weeks ago. He wanted to be that person again. He just needed to force his brain to bounce back. Easy. Mr. Yamada was the one who picked Mei up an hour later. She quickly gathered the sketches she'd spread across the room and was still mumbling her thoughts about the prosthetic as she was ushered down the hall. Silence in the room. Izuku found it difficult to look up from his clenched fist. Heard rather than saw Mr. Aizawa come closer, taking his usual spot beside the bed. There was more silence following him. Izuku heard Mr. Aizawa take a breath, not looking up as the man said, I wasn't going to say anything before, but I think you need to hear it. Maybe I need to say it, too. The man shrugged. I know what the doctor did. Everything. He jerked his head toward his teacher, staring in disbelief. You know? The man nodded sadly. Yeah. He finally talked. We also found notes and, Mr. Aizawa sighed, shoulders slumping. He took a video. Of him working. Izuku closed his eyes against the image. A video of him working. Opening Izuku up like a treasure chest. It made him sick just thinking about it. I'm sorry, kid. No. Not him. Izuku couldn't handle it from him, not after hearing it from everyone else. His eyes snapped open and he stared at nothing. Don't. His hand ached as he gripped the blanket. What he really wanted to do was hit something. He wanted to go to the gym and work out. He wanted to use his quirk and spar with his classmates again. I am broken, he said, more to himself than his teacher. I'm not capable like I was before, not anymore. I'm weak. I'm well aware of these things and I don't need to be reminded of it by you and everyone else who comes in here looking at me with that same expression. I understand this has been hard on everyone. Don't you think I know that? But I'm not strong enough to get myself and you all through this. He couldn't look at his teacher. He knew he was acting irrationally, that he was frustrated and tired and in pain and it was clouding his judgment. But while he knew that, it didn't make him feel any better. Mr. Aizawa reached out and took his hand, massaging his palm until he relaxed it. He couldn't look at the man, even as he began speaking, voice soft and soothing. When I was hurt, during the war, I was in a position similar to yours. I was suddenly cut down, forced into a vulnerable state that I didn't know how to escape from. And I had friends coming in and out, constantly reminding me of the condition I was in. They were trying to help. They were trying to show me they cared. But I hated it. The pity in their eyes, the way no one spoke to me like they had before I was suddenly less than the hero I was. I hated how everyone seemed to coddle me. I mean, I'm an underground hero, no matter my condition. Treat me like it. Mr. Aizawa let out a soft chuckle. Izuku closed his eyes, tears burning as they flooded his vision. I imagine that's how you're feeling. The man sighed, his hands never stopping their movements around Izuku's. It was nice. I get it now. How everyone else felt coming into my hospital room. Everyone kept saying they were sorry. Sorry. That seemed to be the only word they could come up with. And here I am, finding myself without anything else to say either. Izuku bowed his head, chin hitting his chest. Everything hurt. His body. His spirit. His mind. How did he feel worse now than he did with the doctor? I just want this to be over, he said with a sob. I want to go back to before this ever happened. Because right now? Right now I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. All I see is this new handicap. This thing that makes me a liability. It doesn't matter if I get a prosthetic or not. It doesn't matter if I somehow end up becoming a hero. I won't ever be as strong as I was before. He gave a miserable cry, tears quickly falling to his lap. How do I live up to the expectations others have for me, that I have for myself, if I don't have a fool's hope of reaching them? Kid, look at me. The command in his teacher's tone was enough to get him to look over, not caring how weak or pathetic he looked with tears running down his cheeks, eyes surely bloodshot. Mr. Aizawa put a hand on Izuku's chest, steady gaze never wavering. You will be an amazing hero. You're strong and passionate and so caring it hurts my heart sometimes. It isn't the quirk that makes you this way. It isn't having both your arms. You're like this because it's your heart, your very nature. You are a hero. Not the job title, not the rankings. You are a hero for others because you have weaknesses. You understand fear and pain and seek to keep others from enduring it. That is what makes you so special. What we're all so sorry about is seeing someone with the heart of gold suffering because you try so hard to keep everyone else from ending up in your position. So stop wallowing in the thoughts that you will never be enough. Because you will always be enough. No matter what happens or what you're capable of. Mr. Aizawa seemed startled as Izuku suddenly threw his arm around the man, pulling him in close. Izuku cried, loud and completely without grace, into the man's shirt. Uncaring how it looked or how awkward it might be later. He needed to break and the only person he knew who would understand was right there in front of him. It was nearly an hour later that Izuku felt up to talking again. Mr. Aizawa helped him lay back in bed, calling for a nurse when it was clear the pain was finally getting to him. She gave him something through the four, the teen having to look away while she did it. It won't knock you out, but you might get a little sleepy, she told him. He relaxed against the bed as soon as it kicked in, throwing a veil over his injuries. While he felt them, they were distant, muffled. Less like a lion raking its claws down his body. I wanted to talk to you about something, but we can discuss it later if you'd like. Mr. Aizawa raised his brows. Up to you. Might as well get it over with, whatever it was. Now is fine. The man nodded, resigned. It's about Eri. It was a touchy subject, but one Izuku had been thinking about for a little while. After everything else they discussed, talking about the little girl wasn't nearly the worst of it. I've already made a decision about it, he said, startling Mr. Aizawa. The man's brows came together in concern, though they smoothed out as soon as Izuku explained. I'm aware of her limitations. I know trying to heal me could hurt her or myself. I know she doesn't have full control of it just yet. I also know that if I asked her to try, she'd do it. That sweet girl had blossomed since they'd rescued her from Overhaul. He would never ask her to jeopardize the progress she'd made. His mouth quirked up just thinking about her. He loved her like a little sister. He always would. She was part of the reason he pushed himself so hard. I don't want to put that much pressure on her. She's still learning to use her quirk and she'd feel obligated to be perfect. Any failure on her part would set her back. I don't want her to internalize it. He didn't want to risk it yet, not for him and not for Eri. While he mourned the loss of his limb, it wasn't worth what he could lose if things went wrong trying to fix it. Maybe in the future, he didn't want to risk getting his hopes up, but he still held on to the thought that maybe, one day, she could do it. But for now, you're amazing, you know that? Mr. Aizawa asked, though he knew it didn't warrant a reply. XXX. When Izuku was discharged from the hospital, he was still covered in bandages and about as strong as a newborn deer. But he felt better, physically, at least. He was going back to the dorms for safety reasons, mostly. His class had made enough of a name for themselves that villains would gladly jump on the opportunity to tear him down while he was at his weakest. Besides, UA would be able to accommodate what he needed until he was back on his feet. His mom hadn't been the happiest about it, but he agreed with it and ended up strong-arming her into doing the same. That had been a long conversation. In the end, she had allowed him to leave her side once more, though she demanded more phone calls and frequent updates. It was a compromise he was happy with. The thought of sitting in their apartment while his classmates attended classes made him sick. He loved his mom dearly, but he needed to be there with his class. Mr. Aizawa was the one who came to the hospital to take him back to the dorms. The man waited patiently while Izuku got dressed in his normal clothes, only stepping in to tie up his shirt when it became clear to the two of them that the way it was flapping in the breeze due to the new missing space was unacceptable. He appreciated it. The man led him to a car waiting along the curb, and even just that small trek had him feeling tired. He needed to get back on track again. Workout regimen, healthy diet, a concrete schedule. He needed to get back to fighting shape. Mr. Aizawa stopped him as they reached the dorm doors, sighing with regret. I wasn't going to spoil the surprise, but I think it's best I do. They have a surprise party planned. To welcome you back home. Oh, that was exciting? Honestly, Izuku wanted to go back to his dorm room and sleep, but clearly that wasn't going to happen. Thank you for telling me. His teacher shrugged. Hisashi tried to pull the same sheet when I got out of the hospital. As soon as the door was pulled open, Izuku was met by his enthusiastic classmates. They'd all seen his injuries and thankfully didn't make a big deal out of them as he entered. He was immediately SCKED into their orbit, forced to be the guest of honor and the center of attention. There was cake and snacks and music. For some reason, there was an All Might movie playing, though he couldn't hear any of the dialogue because of everything else. Because you like All Might? Ashido explained, gesturing to the man on the screen. His classmates had decorated the common area like there was no tomorrow. It must have taken hours to make them and put them up. While he appreciated the gesture and the effort put in, by the end of it he was about ready to scream. But it was fine. It was fine. He could get through it. Until someone in the kitchen accidentally dropped a metal fork into the sink, the utensil clanging on other utensils. Metal against metal. A scalpel on a tray. He was fine until a door opened and loud footsteps came toward him. The doctor coming to hurt him again, to play with him until he broke. Maybe he wasn't fine. Izuku bolted from his seat and fled from the room, vision tilting and ringing suddenly overwhelming his ears. He couldn't hear the shouts of concern from his classmates or his own panicked breathing. All he could hear was the doctor's voice in his head, the sounds of the man moving around the table he was strapped down upon. All he knew was the feeling of a scalpel cutting through his skin and the doctor's casual remarks. As if what he was doing was nothing. As if it was normal. All Izuku knew was the feeling of a tube being shoved down his throat and the helplessness of those restraints holding him down. He ended up on the bathroom floor, back against the wall and hand gripping tightly to his hair. Tugging and tugging on the roots. He wasn't seeing anything, though his eyes remained wide. He was waiting for the doctor to come to his side, waiting for the next round of terror and fresh hell that was only created in that man's brain. The door opened and he flinched back against the wall, screwing his eyes shut as tightly as he could and curling into the smallest form he could manage. What's happening? What's wrong? Someone asked in a whisper. Everyone get out. He's having a panic attack and more bodies aren't going to help, someone else snapped. The tone made Izuku flinch again. There were footsteps and then nothing. Tears rolled down his face. It's Shinso here. I'm sitting next to you. No one else is here. It's just the two of us. The voice was soft. It was nice. It wasn't the doctor. Izuku didn't reply. He couldn't reply. There was a long silence. It stretched on for an eternity. But he couldn't get his heart to stop pounding. He couldn't force his body to stop shaking. He forgot about Shinso sitting beside him until the teen spoke up. Do you want me to use my quirk? To calm you down? Izuku considered it. He felt like he was dying, sitting there on the bathroom floor. He couldn't see past the panic. But the thought of having Shinso use his quirk to stop it, messing with his mind and taking away any amount of control he still had, made him want to scream. No. Please, no, he answered, curling over himself even tighter. Eventually, Izuku tired himself out. He wasn't asleep, though, instead remaining near catatonic. He wasn't aware of Shinso calling Mr. Aizawa, speaking softly into his phone. He wasn't aware of Mr. Aizawa entering the bathroom and crouching down in front of him. His teacher attempted to speak to him, but he didn't get a reply. I'm going to take him to his room. Tell the rest of your class to clear out of the area, Mr. Aizawa murmured to Shinso. The teen nodded and left, barking out orders to those still lingering outside. Izuku vaguely recognized a hand on his shoulder, warm and comforting. But he couldn't raise his head. He couldn't acknowledge it. He was a pillar of stone, no longer a human being. I'm going to pick you up, okay? He didn't stir as the man hefted him up in his arms and carried him out of the bathroom. He lost time, though only a few minutes. By the time the stone prison he seemed to have fallen into crumbled away, he was left feeling absolutely exhausted. Worn. He blinked as Mr. Aizawa appeared beside him, pulling a blanket up to his waist. Izuku realized he was lying on his bed in his dorm room, surrounded by all the things that reminded him of his time at UA. When his teacher noticed his eyes tracking his movements, he stopped. You with me, kid? Yeah. Though, he felt about a foot away from his body, watching it all happen to him instead of doing it himself. The man nodded. Why don't you get some rest? I know it's been a hard day. Mr. Aizawa moved to leave, but Izuku caught his wrist. The man stared down at him, surprised by the action. Wait. Don't leave. Despite the man being his teacher, despite the fact that Izuku was nearly an adult, he pleaded for his teacher to stay. His teacher sat on the edge of Izuku's mattress, allowing Izuku to hold on to his hand. You want to talk about it? Mr. Aizawa asked. Izuku shook his head, closing his eyes. He just wanted to sleep, but the thought of drifting off all alone in his room was too much. All right. I'll stay until you fall asleep, okay? That was how he found himself finally giving in to sleep with a hand gently sifting through his hair. The nightmares didn't find him that night. XXX. You have to be gentle. It's healed, but it's still not calloused, Izuku reminded Mei, gesturing to the end of his arm, the stump. He hated that word, but there was really no other way to describe it. She didn't indicate she heard him. He sighed, slumping down on the stool she'd practically thrown him onto the minute he stepped foot into the lab. That day, he was there to test out the new prosthetic she'd been making for him. He wouldn't be able to use his quirk with the prosthetic, but he could still use it for other things. The thought of being able to tie his own shoes again was a relief, as strange as it was. For the past month, he'd been forcing himself to adapt to his new state. As it turned out, being down a hand changed a lot of things in his life. He'd found himself relying on his friends for plenty of things. They'd been wonderfully accommodating, reminding him often that they were happy to help however they could. Though, it didn't stop him from feeling like a burden. Graduation was only a few weeks away. He had been training with his quirk since he was cleared by Recovery Girl, pushing himself incredibly hard to get back to the level he'd been at before. He wasn't there just yet, but he was getting closer. The other day, he'd almost beaten Bakugo in sparring, though the other teen had pinned him down and Izuku didn't have the other arm to shove him off. Physically, Izuku was doing amazing. He found it difficult sometimes to look at the scars left behind, and he often had to remind himself that his classmates weren't staring them all the time. Since leaving the hospital, he'd been focusing on getting stronger, on his skills and making himself capable again. It was a welcome distraction. He still had nightmares nearly every night. He'd stopped waking up crying, at least. There were times after waking up that he couldn't bear to see his bare skin, the scars throwing him back to that time. Recovery Girl had sadly told him she couldn't get rid of them, which was expected but disappointing. Eri had also offered to try, along with attempting to regrow his arm, but he'd told her no. For now. Even if she got rid of the scars, it wouldn't erase the memories. He would still wake up feeling the pain, hearing footsteps coming closer, hearing the scalpel against the table. His classmates were wonderful and understanding. Even Bakugo. They hadn't hovered during those first few weeks when sounds or smells would send him into a spiral. They never took offense if he couldn't bring himself to be around them in the evenings, too overwhelmed to carry on simple conversations. It had actually been news from Tartarus that helped his recovery. Though, he kept that to himself. A week after the doctor had been put in Tartarus, Mr. Aizawa came to Izuku and told him what had happened. Apparently, there were several powerful Yakuza members in Tartarus who held a grudge against the doctor. The man had kidnapped one of their friends, killing him in an attempt to turn him into a Nomu. The Yakuza members didn't let that kind of thing go easily. The doctor had been killed in his cell in the name of revenge, his death confirmed by two heroes. Izuku had locked himself in his dorm room after hearing the news, not opening it for any of his friends who came and asked if he was okay. Because that was the thing, he was more than okay. The doctor was dead, gutted by other criminals in prison with him. Izuku felt guilty for the joy that came from the news. With the doctor dead, there was no chance of him escaping and hurting Izuku again. There would never be more experiments. He kept his thoughts to himself. He loved his friends, his classmates, and he knew they wouldn't judge him for how he felt, but he couldn't bring himself to speak it into existence. Mei worked quickly as she put the prosthetic on what remained of his arm. He'd had a connection for the prosthetic installed in his arm last week. It was drilled into the bone and would allow the prosthetic to connect directly to his arm instead of simply sitting on the end of his arm. He'd spoken to plenty of specialists and heroes who had the same or similar prosthetics and decided it was what was best for his future. Of course, he couldn't feel with the prosthetic like he could with his other hand, but he marveled at the extremity he suddenly had again. He could move the fingers and wrist just as he could before. "It's beautiful," he whispered, unable to take his eyes away from it. Mei beamed. "Of course it is. It's my creation. I didn't work this long on this thing for it to be second-rate." She went over the repair process and replacement with him, but he wasn't listening. Finally, he was taking another step forward. By the time graduation day came, his prosthetic felt much more natural, as if he'd been wearing it for longer than a few weeks. As he climbed the stairs to the stage and shook Nizu's paw, metal fingers taking his diploma, he felt the spark return. There it was, that familiar thrum in his chest that filled him with hope and excitement. After the doctor heard him, he'd thought it had slipped away for good. He found himself grinning. As he turned and faced the gathered crowd below the stage, he knew the doctor hadn't ruined him. He'd tried, certainly, but Izuku was still standing. He scanned the crowd, finding his classmates and his family. He spotted his teachers who had supported him through everything, even when it was the hardest thing they had ever done. He met the eye of his mom, feeling his heart flutter with adoration. They were all the reason he was standing there. They were the ones who got him out and saved him from complete destruction. They were his heroes. He wasn't as strong as he was before. He couldn't use his quirk with his left arm. There were times when he couldn't stop seeing what had been done to him. A part of him was still strapped on that table begging to be released. But he would get there. He would be the hero he wanted to be. He would be okay. Maybe not that day, maybe not tomorrow, but he would eventually look back on his scars and realize the time he'd spent at his lowest had not broken him.
Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.